Infertile, divorced, loser, college dropout, penniless, forgotten. Those 6 words glared from a 30-foot projector screen at my sister's wedding reception. The harsh white font burned through the dim romantic lighting of the Grand Minnetonka Lakeside estate, casting a sickly glow over the crystal centerpieces and the imported orchids. A heavy beat of stunned silence hung in the humid summer air, swiftly followed by a rising tide of laughter from 300 well-dressed guests. At the head table, my 27-year-old sister Harper leaned into her microphone. She wore a custom silk gown, her makeup flawless, her smile razor-thin. "Be careful," she cooed, her voice echoing through the surround sound speakers. She might burst into tears. Beside her, our mother Nancy offered a delicate, practiced smile. She ran a manicured finger down the stem of her glass, taking a slow sip of vintage champagne like she was enjoying a private theater performance. Our father, Howard, adjusted the lapels of his tailored tuxedo and let out a hearty chuckle. "Lighten up, honey," he called out over the amusement of the crowd. This was their brand of hospitality, the classic Minnesota nice facade, covering a foundation of casual cruelty. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to drop my gaze, grip the edges of my cheap bridesmaid dress, and run out the heavy mahogany doors in shame. They needed me to validate the narrative they had meticulously crafted for decades, the story where Harper was the golden child, and I was the tragic, broken failure. In the front row sat Trent, my ex-husband. He was nervously tapping a silver hospital pen against his knee. The rhythmic click of the metal provided a strange metronome to the humiliation unfolding around me. He looked out of place among the socialites, but hungry. Harper had lured him here with the promise of introductions to mystery venture capitalists who could rescue his failing medical practice. He scanned the room for wealthy lifelines, entirely unaware he was sitting inside a trap of my own making. I did not cry. My heartbeat steadied cold and rhythmic against my ribs. I reached into my silk clutch, pulled out my phone, and typed a single word to the estate manager. Now. Before I reveal how that one text dismantled 32 years of my family's pristine reputation, welcome to the Amanda Told Stories channel. If this narrative resonates with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with my journey. Also, drop a comment below letting me know how old you are and where you are listening from. My name is Eileen Wallace. I am 32 years old, and what you are about to hear is the moment I permanently closed the bank of family forgiveness. I hit send, and the world shifted. The string quartet in the corner stopped mid-note, their bows hovering awkwardly over their cellos. A second later, the grand overhead chandeliers blazed to life, erasing the soft, romantic ambiance and flooding the ballroom with stark, unforgiving light. Guests shielded their eyes, murmuring in confusion. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung inward with a loud thud that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. A coordinated team of private security guards stepped into the ballroom. They wore dark suits, their expressions unreadable, their boots stepping in perfect unison against the polished marble floor. I watched the venue manager, a stoic man named Vance, walk straight down the center aisle. He held a crisp, cream-colored document folder in his right hand. He did not look at the confused socialites, the whispering groomsmen, or the wealthy relatives pointing fingers. His gaze remained locked on the head table. For 6 months, my parents and sister had ignored the venue invoices. The wedding bill stood at $85,000, a sum they assumed they could charm or negotiate their way out of after the fact. What they did not know was that I am the silent owner of this entire luxury property. I had instructed Vance to place an administrative hold on the collections, giving my biological family enough rope to either hang themselves or prove they possessed a shred of decency. The projector slide proved they had made their choice. Vance reached the front of the room. Without a word of greeting, he reached up and unplugged the main cable from the media cart. The cruel words vanished into blackness, replaced by the low hum of the air conditioning. The sudden absence of the screen left Harper staring at her own reflection in the darkened glass of the venue windows. Vance placed the cream-colored folder neatly on the table right next to Harper's untouched 5-tier fondant cake. "The event is terminated due to non-payment," Vance announced. His voice was not raised, yet it carried effortlessly across the breathless room. "You have 15 minutes to vacate the premises." Harper's jaw dropped. The microphone slipped from her fingers, hitting the table with a sharp screech of feedback that made several guests wince. "Excuse me," Howard boomed, standing up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He puffed out his chest, adopting the deep, authoritative tone he used to intimidate retail suppliers. "You must be confused. I am Howard Wallace. We have an arrangement with the ownership." "You have a debt, sir." Vance corrected his tone, chillingly polite. "A debt that is 180 days past due. The grace period expired the moment the ownership lifted the administrative hold 2 minutes ago. Security will now begin directing your guests toward the exits." Nancy slammed her champagne glass down, the liquid spilling over the rim and staining the pristine white tablecloth. She pointed a trembling finger at Vance. "Do you know who we are? You are ruining my daughter's perfect day. I demand to speak to the owner of this estate immediately." Vance turned his head, his eyes scanning the room before landing directly on me. He offered a short, respectful nod. "The owner is already here, ma'am," Vance said, "and she is the one who ordered the eviction." The silence that followed was suffocating. 300 pairs of eyes shifted from Vance to follow the direction of his gaze, landing squarely on me. I stood near the back row, my posture straight, the cheap fabric of my bridesmaid dress no longer feeling like a uniform of defeat, but a costume I was finally ready to shed. Trent stopped tapping his silver hospital pen. It slipped from his grip, clattering onto the hardwood floor. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the gears in his head failing to process the reality of the situation. The woman he had discarded, the woman Harper had just branded a penniless loser on a 30-foot screen, held the deed to the ground they were standing on. Harper gripped the edges of the head table, her knuckles turning white. Her pristine image was fracturing in real time. The guests, sensing the shift in power, began whispering furiously. A few people in the back rows were already pulling out their phones, the lenses focused on the spectacular unraveling of the Wallace family. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply met my father's horrified stare, feeling the cool draft of the Minnesota evening rolling off the lake outside, knowing this was only the first domino to fall. The catering staff moved into the ballroom like a tactical unit executing a raid. Waiters wearing crisp black uniforms marched through the service doors carrying heavy gray plastic storage bins, their faces devoid of any expression. The illusion of a high society event shattered to the sound of fine silverware being dumped unceremoniously into the plastic tubs. The romantic ambiance dissolved as workers began plucking the imported white orchids from their crystal vases, water dripping onto the silk tablecloths in dark, spreading stains. Nancy pushed her way past a bewildered groomsman, her pristine composure fractured, replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed panic. She stepped directly into the path of a waiter who was reaching for the tiered caviar station, slapping her hand down onto the serving tray. "You will not touch that!" Nancy ordered, her voice shrill enough to cut through the mounting chaos. She turned her glare back to Vance, the venue manager, her chest heaving under her designer gown. "This is an outrage. I do not care what kind of sick joke my troubled daughter is playing. You are the manager of this facility. You work for the hospitality group. I am going to have your job for indulging this stunt." Vance did not flinch. He signaled to a pair of security guards who stepped smoothly between Nancy and the caviar station. "I work for the property owner, ma'am," Vance replied, his tone steady and professional. "And she has given you 14 minutes to vacate." Howard marched forward, his face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a thick finger at me from across the dance floor. "Eileen, whatever pathetic game this is, it ends right now. You are embarrassing yourself. Tell this man you are sorry and go wait in the car. We will deal with your behavior at home." I stepped out of the shadows near the back row. The cheap fabric of my bridesmaid dress rustled as I walked down the center aisle. 300 pairs of eyes tracked my every movement. The silence in the room was so profound, I could hear the rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished marble floor. I did not stop until I stood mere feet from the head table, forcing my parents and my sister to look me in the eye. "I am not going to the car, Howard," I said, tasting the freedom of using his first name. "And we do not have a home together. You have a house in the suburbs that you are struggling to keep, and I have a penthouse overlooking the Mississippi River. I also have the deed to this estate, the surrounding 50 acres, and the hospitality management group that employs Vance." Harper let out a sharp, mocking laugh, though her eyes darted nervously around the room. "You are delusional," she scoffed, gripping the microphone stand. "You dropped out of state college. You have nothing. Mom and Dad had to buy that dress you are wearing just so you would not look like trash in my wedding photos. You should check your facts before you broadcast them on a 30-foot screen," I said, keeping my voice even. "I did not drop out. I transferred my credits to a dual degree program while you were busy spending Dad's retail profits on spring break trips. I spent the last 10 years building a biomedical logistics firm from the ground up. I manage supply chains for research hospitals across 3 continents. In less than a month, my company is filing an initial public offering that will value my holdings in the 10-figure range." The words hung in the air, thick and undeniable. I watched the reality wash over my parents. Nancy's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. The smug certainty in Howard's eyes flickered, replaced by a deep, unsettling doubt. They had spent decades casting me as the family failure, the cautionary tale they whispered about at country club dinners. Confronted with the truth, their entire worldview began to crumble. Harper refused to accept it. She stomped her foot against the raised platform, her face twisting into a mask of pure entitlement. Her acrylic nails dug into the silk tablecloth until the fabric tore with a loud rip. "I do not care what kind of fake business you claim to have," Harper shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "This is my perfect day. You are just jealous because I am beautiful and happy, and you are a barren, divorced loser. Logan will not let you do this to me." She turned to her new husband, expecting him to ride to her rescue. "Logan, tell them," she demanded, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Tell them how much money you have. Tell her you will buy this entire lake and fire every single person in this room." Logan did not move. He stood frozen next to the wedding cake, his face the color of wet ash. He was staring at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, suffocating horror. Logan had spent the last 2 years building a tech retail startup. For the past 6 months, Harper had bragged to anyone who would listen about her brilliant fiancé and his impending wealth. She boasted about his genius software, his sleek downtown office, and the mysterious venture capital firm that was pouring millions into his vision. Logan swallowed hard. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, catching the glare of the chandeliers. "Wallace," he whispered, his voice trembling so badly the word barely registered. "Wallace Equity Partners." "That is right," Harper cheered, missing the terror in his tone entirely. "Wallace Equity. They are giving him $8 million next week. So you can take your little caterers and get out of my sight. Logan squeezed his eyes shut. His hands gripped the edge of the table as if the floor was dropping out from underneath him. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me, the final puzzle piece locking into place. The mysterious chairwoman of the capital firm backing his entire life's work. The silent investor who never attended the board meetings, who operated entirely through proxies whose signature was required for the upcoming Series B funding round that would keep his servers running. Shut up, Harper. Logan breathed out the words raw and ragged. Excuse me? Harper gasped, recoiling as if he had struck her. I said shut your mouth, Logan yelled, turning on his new bride with a look of pure loathing. Do you have any idea what you have just done? Do you know who she is? She owns my cap table. She owns my company. The dynamics of their 48-hour marriage fractured instantly in front of 300 guests. Harper stumbled back her designer gown, catching on a chair leg. She looked from Logan to me, the arrogant smirk finally melting off her face, replaced by a profound, humiliating confusion. From the edge of the crowd, Trent stepped forward. He smoothed the lapels of his suit, putting on his best bedside manner, the same patronizing demeanor he used to manipulate his patients and my parents. Let us just all take a breath, Trent said, holding his hands up in a gesture of false peace. He walked toward me, a condescending smile playing on his lips. Elle, you are emotional. I know seeing me here today brought up a lot of unresolved trauma for you. It is understandable that you are lashing out. But this is not you. Let the staff pour the champagne back, and we can go somewhere quiet to talk through these feelings. He reached out to place a comforting hand on my shoulder. I stepped back, my gaze dropping to his outstretched fingers, then rising to meet his eyes. Do not ever touch me, Trent, I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the humid air. And do not try to diagnose me to save your own ego. You are not here to support Harper. You are here because your private practice is drowning in debt. Your patient retention is at an all-time low, and you thought you could network your way into a bailout at this reception. Trent dropped his hand. The color drained from his cheeks. The guests closest to us began murmuring, the whispers spreading outward like a shockwave. I am not emotional, I continued, ensuring my voice carried to the back of the room. I am highly competent. That is how I built an empire, while you were busy hiding assets and ruining your career. I suggest you locate the nearest exit before Vance House Security remove you by force. Trent opened his mouth to reply, but the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall slammed open again. A fresh wave of security personnel flooded the room, holding clear plastic bags. They began systematically dismantling the floral archway where Harper had taken her vows just an hour earlier. The wedding was dead. The lavish facade my parents had paid for with lies and manipulation was being packed away into gray plastic tubs. Guests were already filing out the side doors, heads down, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of the Wallace family collapse. Vance stepped up beside me. 10 minutes, Miss Wallace, he murmured. I nodded, turning my back on the head table. I walked toward the side exit leading out to the manicured estate gardens, needing a moment of fresh air to clear the overwhelming scent of wilting orchids from my lungs. But as the glass door swung shut behind me, the heavy crunch of footsteps on the gravel path signaled that I was not alone. Trent was following me into the dark. The cool air of the Minnesota night hit my face the moment I pushed through the glass terrace doors. I breathed in the scent of damp pine needles and fresh soil, letting the crisp breeze wash away the suffocating aroma of wilted orchids and stale champagne. The gravel path crunched beneath my heels as I walked toward the sweeping circular driveway where a black luxury SUV idled quietly, waiting to take me back to the city. Before I could reach the safety of the vehicle, heavy footsteps pounded on the stone walkway behind me. "Eileen, wait!" Trent darted around me, planting his feet firmly on the path and blocking my route to the car. The condescending bedside manner he had worn inside the ballroom was gone, replaced by a sneering, vicious mask. The dim glow of the garden string lights cast harsh shadows across his cheekbones, highlighting the desperate sweat pooling at his temples. He was no longer the charming physician trying to network his way out of debt. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. "You think you are so smart," Trent hissed, taking a step closer. "You think because you have money now, you can humiliate me in front of those people? You are nothing but a cold, empty corporate machine. That is why nobody wants you. That is why you could not even give me a child." He aimed straight for the deepest scar he could find, hoping to shatter my composure. "You are broken inside, Eileen," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "A barren shell. You can buy all the real estate in the world, but you will always be a defective woman." His words were designed to rip open the old wounds of my infertility trauma, to drag me back to the darkest day of my life, and for a fraction of a second, the garden around me faded. The scent of pine was replaced by the stinging odor of medical-grade bleach and rubbing alcohol. 3 years ago, I lay in a sterile hospital bed staring at the fluorescent lights humming on the ceiling. The rhythmic beep of the fetal monitor had flatlined into a devastating continuous tone. The physical pain of the miscarriage was a dull ache compared to the crushing weight settling over my chest. I felt hollowed out, staring blankly at the white sheets stained with the end of my dreams of motherhood. But the true nightmare of that day was not the medical emergency. It was the moment the door to my recovery room swung open. My mother had rushed into the ward. Nancy did not look at me. She did not walk to the side of my bed to hold my trembling hand, nor did she brush the damp hair from my forehead. Instead, she bypassed me entirely and walked straight to Trent, who was sitting in the corner chair. She wrapped her arms around my husband, pulling him into a deep, comforting embrace. "I am so sorry, Trent," Nancy had whispered, rubbing his back in slow, soothing circles. "This must be so incredibly hard for you. Do not worry. We will get you through this." I lay there bleeding, physically and emotionally shattered, while my mother comforted my husband for the inconvenience of my failure. She treated me as nothing more than a faulty incubator that had disappointed her favorite son-in-law. That was the day I realized my biological family did not view me as a human being. I was an asset, and when my value dropped, their affection vanished. The flashback dissolved, leaving me standing on the gravel path under the Minnesota stars. I looked at Trent now, studying his sneering face, waiting for the tears he desperately wanted to provoke. They never came. I felt nothing but a quiet, clinical pity. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice flat and unbothered. Trent blinked, thrown off balance by my icy reaction. He opened his mouth to launch another insult, but I raised my hand, signaling to the shadows near the edge of the terrace. Vance stepped out from the darkness. The venue manager had followed at a discreet distance, carrying a sleek black leather portfolio. He handed it to me with a respectful nod and stepped back, blending seamlessly into the night. I unzipped the portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of printed documents, holding them out to Trent. "Take them," I commanded. Trent hesitated, his eyes darting to the papers. He snatched them from my grip, tilting the pages toward the dim garden lights to read the text. It took exactly 3 seconds for his vicious sneer to collapse into unadulterated panic. "During our divorce proceedings, you claimed your private medical practice was operating at a severe loss," I said, maintaining a conversational tone while dismantling his life. You submitted sworn affidavits stating you were drowning in operational debt, ensuring you walked away without paying a single dime in alimony while forcing me to cover the legal fees. Trent stared at the top sheet, his hands beginning to shake so badly the paper rattled. "What is this?" he choked out, his vocal cords tightening. "That is a forensic audit," I replied. "My financial team spent the last 8 months tracing the hidden revenue you siphoned out of your clinic. They found the shell companies you set up in Belize, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the ghost payrolls you used to mask $3.2 million in hidden assets." Trent stumbled backward, hitting a stone bird bath. The air seemed to leave his lungs all at once. The arrogant physician was gone, replaced by a terrified criminal, staring at the blueprints of his own destruction. "You hacked my clinic," he stammered, looking around wildly as if expecting the police to emerge from the bushes. "This is illegal. You cannot use this in family court. No judge will admit stolen records." "I am not taking you to family court, Trent," I corrected him, stepping closer so he could hear every single syllable clearly. "I am a corporate executive. I do not waste time arguing over marital scraps. I sent these files directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service this morning at 8 o'clock. By next week, you will not just lose your medical license. You will be facing federal tax evasion charges." Trent dropped the papers. They scattered across the gravel like dead leaves. He fell to his knees, his hands gripping his hair, a pathetic sob escaping his throat. Before I could watch the rest of his breakdown, the frantic clicking of high heels echoed off the stone terrace. Nancy came hurtling down the pathway, her designer gown hitched up around her knees. Her hair, previously sprayed into a stiff, flawless helmet, now stuck out in erratic directions. She stormed right past Trent, completely ignoring the fact that her former son-in-law was weeping in the dirt. She did not ask what he had said to me. She did not care if I was hurt. She marched straight up to my face, her eyes wild with social desperation. "Eileen Wallace," Nancy shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at the venue doors. "You march back in there right now. You find that manager and you write a check for $85,000. The catering staff is packing up the prime rib. Howard's business partners are watching security guards take away their centerpieces. You are turning us into a laughingstock." She actually believed I would comply. Decades of conditioning told her that if she yelled loud enough, if she applied enough public pressure, the quiet, obedient daughter would open her wallet to fix the family reputation. I looked from my mother's frantic face to Trent's sobbing form on the ground. They deserved each other. I turned my back on her and walked to the waiting SUV. The driver, anticipating my arrival, swung the heavy door open. I climbed into the plush leather seat and looked out at my mother, who was now pounding her fists against the tinted window glass, screaming words I could no longer hear. "Drive," I told the chauffeur. The engine purred to life. We pulled away from the estate, leaving Nancy and Trent in the dust of the driveway, swallowed by the darkness of the Minnesota night. I settled back into the seat, letting out a long, slow breath as the tension melted from my shoulders. The first phase of my liberation was complete. I closed my eyes, savoring the silence of the luxury cabin. Then my phone buzzed in my lap. I opened my eyes, annoyed by the interruption. It was an urgent alert from the director of public relations at my logistics firm. A red flag notification signaling a rapid spike in negative online traffic mentioning my name. I tapped the screen, loading the attached link. Harper had not stayed at the venue to deal with her ruined reception. She had fled to a secure location, set up her ring light, and hit record on her phone. I stared at the screen as my sister's tear-streaked face filled the frame, launching a broadcast to millions of followers, setting the stage for a corporate war I never saw coming. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, catching the steam rising from my espresso cup. I stood at the marble kitchen island staring at the tablet screen. Harper was crying. It was a masterful performance utilizing just enough waterproof mascara to look tragic without looking messy. The ring light reflected in her eyes, giving her a manufactured vulnerability. She dabbed her cheeks with a tissue staring directly into the lens. My sister had titled the video, "Surviving a Psychotic Attack on My Wedding Day." The view count at the bottom corner of the screen ticked past 3 million. I took a sip of the bitter coffee, watching her weave a narrative of pure fiction. Harper claimed I was a jealous, unstable spinster who could not handle seeing her find true love. She spun a tale about my supposed mental breakdown, stating I hacked the venue system and brought armed thugs to terrorize her guests. She painted herself as the innocent victim of my corporate bullying. The comment section was a sea of outrage, with thousands of strangers calling for my resignation and demanding justice for the beautiful bride. My phone vibrated against the marble counter, buzzing so relentlessly it nearly slid off the edge. The caller ID flashed the name of my chief public relations officer, a seasoned crisis manager named Marcus. I answered on the second ring, my voice devoid of sleep or panic. "The institutional investors are getting skittish," Marcus said, skipping any pleasantries. "We have 3 major underwriters for the initial public offering who are expressing concern. They do not like instability, Eileen." A viral video claiming our chief executive officer orchestrated a malicious raid on a family event is terrible optics. If this narrative holds, they might leverage it to lower our valuation by $1 per share. That translates to a $100 million loss on opening day. I set my espresso down, the ceramic clinking softly against the stone counter. "Let them express their concern," I replied, staring out at the frozen surface of the Mississippi River far below. "Tell the board I will not dignify an influencer tantrum with a formal press release. I am handling the source directly. Keep the underwriters focused on our Q3 logistics margins. The numbers do not lie." I ended the call before Marcus could argue. I had spent a decade building a biomedical supply chain that saved lives. I was not going to let a spoiled 27-year-old derail my legacy with a ring light and fake tears. A new notification popped onto my screen. A voice message from my father. I tapped play, letting Howard's booming, authoritative tone fill the quiet kitchen. "Eileen, this is your father. I expect you are proud of the little stunt you pulled last night. You embarrassed this family on a monumental scale. Your mother is inconsolable. Harper is trending for all the wrong reasons. You need to issue a public apology immediately and cover the damages to the catering company. I did not raise you to be this bitter. You need to learn how the real world operates. Look at my retail business. I built a regional empire through shrewd negotiations, not by throwing public tantrums. Call me back the second you get this, and we will discuss how you can make this right." I listened to the message a second time, analyzing the deep, patronizing cadence of his voice. Shrewd negotiations. Howard loved that phrase. He used it at every Thanksgiving dinner, boasting about his brilliant business acumen and his flawless reputation in the local chamber of commerce. He believed he was a self-made titan. The profound irony of his arrogance sent a cold, clinical satisfaction washing over me. He had no idea I was the silent entity keeping his regional hardware stores afloat. I deleted the voicemail. I did not owe him a response. I owed him a reckoning. To execute a flawless counteroffensive, I needed to isolate my enemies. Harper was currently leaning on Logan, seeking comfort in her wealthy new husband. I needed to pry them apart, ensuring her safety net evaporated. I opened my secure corporate email client and drafted a message to my executive assistant. I instructed her to order our top-tier platinum gift basket, the kind reserved for our most crucial business partners. I requested 2 bottles of vintage champagne, a selection of imported truffles, and a handwritten card. The message on the card read, "Wishing you a prosperous union and looking forward to solidifying our upcoming financial synergy. Send it directly to Logan at his tech startup headquarters via private courier." This was my bait. Logan was already terrified after realizing I owned the venture capital firm funding his life work. He spent the entire night sweating, expecting a termination notice. When he received the lavish gift basket, he would breathe a heavy sigh of relief. He would assume his business was safe, separating his professional survival from Harper's personal drama. I wanted him to feel secure, complacent, and arrogant. The higher he felt he was flying, the harder he would crash when I cut the cord. With Logan neutralized for the moment, I turned my attention back to Harper. I replayed her viral video, muting the audio. I did not care about her lies anymore. I cared about her surroundings. She was sitting on a plush velvet sofa, framed by a wall of exposed brick and massive industrial-style windows overlooking the North Loop district of downtown Minneapolis. It was a beautiful, highly sought-after luxury condominium. The exact type of premium real estate young influencers craved to project an image of effortless wealth. My parents had told the extended family they rented it for Harper as an early wedding gift, an investment in her brand. They signed the lease through an obscure property management firm, paying $4,000 a month to keep their golden child living in high society. I zoomed in on the brass window fixtures visible over Harper's shoulder. I recognized those fixtures. I picked out those exact handles 2 years ago when my diversified holdings group purchased that entire residential building. I owned the brick wall behind her. I owned the floor she was crying on. My parents were paying rent to a shell corporation that fed directly into my portfolio. Harper was broadcasting a smear campaign against me from inside my own property. I opened a new tab and checked Harper's public social media feed. She had just posted a fresh picture to her story. It showed a pair of crystal flutes filled with orange juice and champagne sitting on a patio table at an upscale brunch spot in the warehouse district. The caption read, "Trying to heal with my girls. Thank you for the endless support during this nightmare." She was out of the building, basking in the sympathy of her followers, sipping mimosas while my stock valuation threatened to dip. The timing was impeccable. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line for the head of my property management division. He answered immediately. "Good morning, Miss Wallace," he said. "I need you to dispatch a maintenance team to the penthouse unit in the North Loop building," I instructed. My voice, crisp and authoritative. "The tenant has violated the morality and defamation clauses hidden in the appendix of her lease agreement. Change the locks on the front door. Deactivate her electronic key fob for the main lobby and the parking garage. I want every designer handbag, every pair of expensive shoes, and every ring light packed into black industrial trash bags and placed by the service dumpster in the back alley." The property manager paused for a fraction of a second, registering the cold severity of the order. "Right away, Miss Wallace. Consider it done." I hung up the phone and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my own penthouse. The winter sun was rising higher over the frozen river, casting a bright light across the city skyline. Harper had spent her entire life taking everything she wanted, protected by a bubble of parental delusion. In about 45 minutes, she was going to return from her luxury brunch to find her key card rejected, her belongings sitting in the trash, and her pristine influencer aesthetic shattered on the concrete. My phone buzzed again, this time flashing an urgent notification from my lobby security desk. Logan had just bypassed the front gate and was sprinting toward my corporate elevators, clutching a gift basket. The pristine environment of my corporate headquarters offered a sanctuary of absolute control. Behind the biometric security gates and the polished granite floors, the floor-to-ceiling glass windows provided a sweeping panoramic view of the Minneapolis skyline. The frigid winter sun reflected off the frozen surface of the river far below, casting long geometric shadows across the sleek architecture. This was my empire, a realm built on logic, supply chain metrics, and ruthless efficiency. It provided a stark contrast to the emotional chaos my biological relatives constantly manufactured. My desk phone emitted a quiet, single chime. Marcus, my head of public relations, informed me that Logan was currently standing in the ground floor lobby. He had bypassed the outer security perimeter simply by flashing the platinum corporate gift basket I had sent him via courier an hour earlier. Logan treated the imported champagne and artisanal truffles like a VIP access pass, assuming the lavish gesture meant our financial relationship was secure. He believed he had successfully insulated his tech startup from his new bride and her viral temper tantrum on social media. I tapped a command sequence on my keyboard, bringing up the closed-circuit security feed on my secondary monitor. The high-definition camera captured Logan stepping through the revolving glass doors. He wore a tailored navy blazer, a crisp white shirt open at the collar, and a confident, relieved smile. He gripped the woven handle of the basket tightly, his knuckles pale against the dark wicker. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the rules of consequence did not apply to him because he was a charming tech entrepreneur on the verge of a lucrative breakthrough. His confident stride faltered abruptly near the reception desk. From the opposite bank of elevators, a pair of my private security contractors emerged into the open atrium. They were flanking Trent. My former husband looked thoroughly disheveled. His luxury silk tie hung loose and crooked around his neck, and his hair stood in erratic, uncombed tufts. Trent had shown up uninvited a few minutes prior, demanding an audience to beg for a settlement regarding the offshore accounts I had reported to the federal authorities. I had denied him entry at the front desk and ordered his immediate removal. The security feed offered a flawless, silent, cinematic parallel. Logan stopped dead in his tracks. Trent paused, attempting to shake off the firm grip of a security guard. The two men locked eyes across the expanse of polished granite floor. One was my past mistake. A deceitful physician facing federal prison and the loss of his medical license. The other was my sister's present mistake, an arrogant startup founder walking willingly into a financial slaughterhouse. They stared at each other, two men who had severely underestimated the quiet, observant woman lingering in the background of their lives. The visual poetry was striking. Trent lowered his gaze, first, defeated, allowing the guards to push him toward the exit doors and out into the biting cold. Logan swallowed hard, adjusted the lapels of his blazer, and stepped into the VIP elevator, blissfully unaware that he was riding up to the top floor to meet the exact same fate. 5 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of my executive boardroom swung inward. I sat at the head of a 20-foot solid mahogany table, my hands folded neatly over a black leather portfolio. The room was designed to intimidate. There were no bright colors or welcoming touches, only dark wood, brushed steel accents, and the sprawling, icy backdrop of the Minnesota winter looming outside the glass. Logan walked, and his leather shoes echoing in the cavernous space. He set the gift basket right in the center of the table, offering a charismatic grin that did not quite reach his nervous eyes. "Good morning," Eileen Logan said, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. "I wanted to come down here personally to thank you for this incredible gesture. I know things got incredibly tense last night at the estate. I want you to know I had zero involvement with that slideshow. That was all Harper and your parents. I told her to take down that ridiculous video she posted this morning. Business is business, and I respect what you have built too much to let family drama interfere with our synergy." I did not return his smile. I unclasped the leather portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across the smooth mahogany surface. It glided effortlessly, stopping mere inches from his fingertips. Synergy is a fascinating word, Logan. I began my voice flat and echoing slightly off the glass walls. You spent the last 2 years developing a retail software platform. You burned through your personal savings. You maxed out your credit lines. You secured an initial seed round of funding that kept your servers running just long enough to reach this upcoming Series B injection. You need the $8 million from my capital firm to launch your beta phase next Tuesday. Without my signature on the final transfer, your entire company defaults on its vendor contracts by Friday afternoon. Logan shifted awkwardly in his ergonomic chair. A distinct bead of sweat formed at his hairline, catching the harsh boardroom lighting. He touched the edge of the paper but did not pick it up to read the text. Yes, he replied, his charismatic tone faltering into a tight rasp. And we are on track. Our user acquisition metrics are flawless right now. The basket you sent proves we are still aligned on the vision. The basket was a distraction, I corrected him, watching the color drain rapidly from his cheeks. I wanted you to feel secure, so you would leave Harper alone in that condo long enough for my property management team to change the locks and evict her belongings. The paper sitting in front of you is a formal notice of termination. Logan recoiled, instantly pulling his hands back as if the document had burned his skin. Termination, he stammered. You cannot do that. We have a signed term sheet. The capital is locked in the escrow account. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the dark wood. I advise you to read subsection 4, paragraph C of your investment contract. It details the morality and reputational harm clauses. It clearly states that any behavior by the founder or their immediate legal family members that brings public defamation or reputational risk to the backing venture firm is grounds for immediate termination of all funding. Logan stared down at the page, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal jargon. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. The catastrophic reality of his situation crashed over him in real time. Harper was his immediate legal family. They had signed a binding marriage certificate less than 48 hours ago. Her highly publicized viral video branding me a psychotic, jealous monster was currently threatening my impending initial public offering. By tying himself to my sister to elevate his social status, he had unwittingly handed me the legal scissors to cut his only financial lifeline. You are pulling the $8 million, Logan whispered, the breath leaving his lungs in a ragged, desperate gasp. Because of a stupid video. Eileen, please. This is my life. This is everything I have worked for since college. I will make her issue a public apology today. I will make her delete her accounts entirely. Just give me 24 hours to fix this mess. There is nothing left to fix, I replied, closing my leather portfolio with a definitive snap. The funds have already been reallocated to a rival tech firm in Seattle. Your startup is dead. Your vendor contracts will default. I highly recommend you retain a bankruptcy attorney before the end of the business day. Logan grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white with the force of his grip. He looked at the imported truffles sitting in the gift basket, finally understanding the cruel irony of the gesture. He married the golden child of the Wallace family, expecting a lifetime of effortless privilege and social elevation. Instead, his new bride had dragged him into a terminal feud with the one person who controlled his destiny. You set me up, Logan accused, his voice cracking with profound despair. You let me marry her, knowing you were going to do this to me. I let you make your own choices, I answered, standing up from my leather executive chair. You chose to sit at that head table last night and laugh while my sister humiliated me in front of 300 people. You chose to align yourself with a family that values perception over basic humanity. I am simply delivering the invoice for your choices. I pressed a silver button hidden under the lip of the table. The heavy oak doors opened immediately. The same two private security contractors who had escorted Trent out of the building stepped into the boardroom. Logan did not fight them. He looked hollowed out, a devastating shadow of the confident entrepreneur who had entered 5 minutes prior. He stood up on shaking legs and walked toward the exit, leaving the platinum baskets sitting untouched on the table. I walked over to the glass mezzanine overlooking the ground floor. I watched from my insulated corporate fortress as Logan reached the main lobby below. He bypassed the reception desk, stumbling toward the revolving doors like a man walking in his sleep. He stopped near a large marble pillar, pulling his phone from his blazer pocket with trembling hands. I could not hear his voice through the thick layers of reinforced glass, but his body language screamed volumes. He dialed a number and pressed the phone hard against his ear. When the call connected, Logan exploded. He paced furiously back and forth across the granite tiles, his free hand chopping through the air in frantic, angry gestures. He was screaming at Harper. He was telling his bride of 48 hours that she had destroyed his life work, his dreams, and his entire future. The fairy tale marriage was over before the ink on the certificate had even dried. He demanded an annulment right there in the public lobby, effectively abandoning her to the fallout of her own reckless actions. A quiet sense of equilibrium settled over my chest. The golden child was losing her husband, her funding, and her housing, all in the span of a single morning. But as I watched Logan storm out into the freezing Minnesota wind, a battered silver sedan pulled into the circular drop-off zone outside my building. My heart rate spiked. I recognized the vehicle immediately. The passenger side door opened, and my mother stepped out onto the curb. She reached into the back seat and pulled out a heavy glass casserole dish covered in shiny aluminum foil. My father emerged from the driver's side, buttoning a thick wool coat, his face set in a mask of determined small-town charm. They had driven up from the southern prairies, bypassing my blocked calls, to ambush me at my workplace. They were wielding their archaic manipulation tactics as if a warm, hot dish could rewrite a lifetime of cruelty. The true battle was walking straight through my front doors. I took the private elevator down to the ground floor. The brushed steel doors parted with a quiet hum, revealing the expansive atrium of my corporate headquarters. The space was designed to reflect precision and modern authority, featuring imported white marble minimalist chrome fixtures and a battalion of suited professionals moving with quiet purpose. Into this carefully curated ecosystem walked my parents, carrying the heavy scent of baked starch and melted cheddar cheese. My mother marched toward the central reception desk, clutching a large glass casserole dish tightly against her chest. The container was wrapped in shiny aluminum foil, reflecting the overhead LED lights like a beacon of archaic manipulation. In her mind, a warm tater-tot hot dish was the universal solvent for any conflict. It was the classic weapon of our regional hospitality, deployed to smother genuine grievances under a thick layer of forced politeness and starchy comfort food. My father trailed slightly behind her, projecting his usual false bravado. He flashed a broad, hearty grin at the stern security guards monitoring the biometric turnstiles. He adjusted his thick wool coat, attempting to exude the aura of a successful local businessman gracing the city with his presence. "Morning," Howard announced to the nearest guard, his voice overly loud in the hushed environment. "We are here to see our daughter, Eileen Wallace, the chief executive. Just a quick family pop-in." The guard remained impassive, crossing his arms over his tactical vest. "You need an appointment and a registered visitor badge to pass the gates, sir." Howard scoffed, shaking his head, as if dealing with an amusingly stubborn child. "Son, I am her father. We do not need badges. We brought her lunch." I stepped out from the shadow of the elevator bank, my heels clicking sharply against the marble tiles. The rhythmic sound drew the attention of several passing executives who paused their conversations to watch the unfolding scene. I walked directly toward the security perimeter, stopping just behind the glass barrier that separated my empire from my biological relatives. "Let them approach the desk," I instructed the guard. The guard stepped aside, allowing Nancy and Howard to move forward. They stopped at the sleek, black granite reception counter. My mother set the heavy glass dish down with a dull thud. The aluminum foil crinkled loudly, a messy, out-of-place sound in the sterile lobby. She offered me a bright, strained smile that did not reach her frantic eyes. "Eileen, sweetheart," Nancy chirped, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness. "We brought your favorite. I woke up early to bake it. Your father and I thought we should all sit down, share a meal, and clear the air. Last night was just a terrible misunderstanding. Emotions were running high and people overreacted." I stared at the foil-covered dish, feeling a profound sense of detachment. A misunderstanding. My sister had broadcast a calculated, vicious smear campaign to 300 people, and my parents had laughed. Now they expected me to erase the trauma in exchange for a casserole. "I do not eat that anymore, Nancy," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal calm. And there was no misunderstanding. You made your priorities incredibly clear. Howard placed his hands on his hips, leaning heavily against the granite counter. "Now listen here, Eileen." He began shifting into his authoritative patriarch routine. "You made your point. You canceled the venue. Harper is devastated, and her new husband is currently throwing a fit about some canceled funding. You taught everyone a lesson. But family is family. We forgive and we move forward. You are going to call Logan right now and fix whatever you broke. Then you are going to wire the $85,000 to the venue so we can salvage the weekend." I looked at my father, studying the desperate entitlement radiating from his posture. He genuinely believed he could order me into submission. "I am not fixing anything," I replied. "I am excising a tumor. You are trespassing in my building, and I want you to leave." The artificial sweetness vanished from my mother's face. The polite mask shattered, revealing the toxic venom simmering just beneath the surface. Her hands curled into tight fists. She slammed her palms down onto the granite counter, the loud crack echoing across the cavernous lobby. Dozens of my employees stopped in their tracks, turning to witness the spectacle. "You ungrateful wretch!" Nancy shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "After everything we did for you, after we put up with your cold, unfeeling personality for 32 years, you think you are better than us because you have this fancy office. You are nothing. You are a bitter, barren woman. No wonder Trent sought comfort elsewhere. No wonder your own body could not carry a child. You are empty inside, Eileen. You will die alone in this glass tower, and nobody will shed a single tear." A shocked silence fell over the lobby. My receptionist gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. The security guards tensed, preparing to physically restrain my mother. I held up a single hand, signaling my staff to stand down. I did not flinch at her cruel words. I did not feel the crushing weight of inadequacy that used to paralyze me whenever she weaponized my medical trauma. I felt only the supreme clarity of knowing I held the detonator to their entire, fake reality. I turned my head slightly and nodded to my executive assistant, who was standing a few feet away. She stepped forward and placed a thick, leather-bound accounting ledger onto the granite counter right next to the cooling hot dish. I reached out and flipped the heavy cover open. The pages were filled with highlighted spreadsheets, wire transfer confirmations, and corporate bank statements. "You love to brag about your retail business, Howard," I said, turning my gaze back to my father. "You boast at every country club dinner about your shrewd negotiations and your regional success." Howard frowned, his bravado faltering as he stared at the dense financial documents. What does my hardware chain have to do with your miserable attitude? Your hardware chain went bankrupt 5 years ago, I informed him, speaking loud enough for the gathered crowd of executives to hear every word. You defaulted on your supplier accounts. The bank threatened to liquidate your inventory. You were weeks away from losing the storefronts. The color rapidly drained from Howard's face. He looked at the ledger, recognizing the logos of the dummy vendor corporations I had used to inject capital into his failing enterprise. Over the past 60 months, I funneled $250,000 into your business to keep you afloat. I continued my tone, clinical and precise. I bought your debt through a subsidiary holding company. Every time you thought you negotiated a brilliant supplier discount, you were actually receiving a hidden subsidy from my logistics firm. You are not a self-made titan, Howard. You are a charity case funded by the daughter you just called a barren wretch. My father opened his mouth, but his vocal cords failed to produce a sound. He gripped the edge of the reception desk, his knees buckling slightly under the weight of the humiliating exposure. His entire identity, his pride, and his community standing were built on a foundation of my silent generosity. Nancy stared at the ledger in sheer horror. She looked at her husband, seeking a denial that never came. The illusion of their superiority was evaporating in the middle of a crowded corporate lobby. But I was not finished. I reached into the back pocket of the leather portfolio and pulled out a single, stark, white legal document bearing the official seal of the state of Minnesota. I slid the paper across the black granite, pushing it directly under my mother's trembling hands. 3 years ago, you took out a substantial second mortgage on the family estate to fund Harper's luxury influencer lifestyle, I said, delivering the final, fatal blow. You fell 6 months behind on those payments. The bank quietly put the note up for auction. My real estate division purchased your underwater mortgage. I hold the deed to the sprawling suburban house you love to show off to your book club. Nancy let out a high-pitched, strangled whimper. She read the bold print at the top of the page. It was a formal notice of foreclosure. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. I told them, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. The locks will be changed on the 1st of the month. If you leave any of your antique furniture behind, it will be donated to a local shelter. I stepped back from the security perimeter. My parents stood frozen in the pristine lobby, stripped of their wealth, their pride, and their shelter. They had nothing left to bargain with, and no facade left to hide behind. I turned my back on them and walked toward my private elevator. I did not look over my shoulder as the security guards finally moved in to escort the sobbing couple out into the freezing winter wind. I left the foil-wrapped casserole sitting untouched on the sleek granite desk, a pathetic monument to a family that no longer existed in my world. As the elevator doors glided shut, sealing me back inside my secure corporate fortress, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen displayed a breaking news alert from a major financial publication. Harper had not just cried on the internet. She had coordinated a targeted, fake ethical boycott against my logistics firm, claiming I utilized unregulated labor in my supply chains. The Golden Child was trying to tank my initial public offering, setting the stage for a boardroom war that would require a much sharper blade. The financial news alert glowed on my phone screen, casting a harsh blue light against the polished chrome walls of my private elevator. My sister had not spent her morning mourning her annulment or packing her designer bags. Instead, she had mobilized her digital army. Harper had launched a coordinated, highly fabricated smear campaign across every major social platform, wielding her tears like a weapon. She initiated a trending hashtag calling for an immediate boycott of my biomedical logistics firm, claiming our supply chains relied on unethical forced labor in developing nations. It was a staggering fabrication devoid of a single shred of factual evidence. Yet in the modern arena of public opinion, the truth rarely matters when pitted against a weeping, beautiful woman demanding justice. Harper urged her millions of followers to flood the inboxes of our institutional investors, demanding they pull out of our impending initial public offering. She aimed her digital artillery directly at the foundation of my empire, attempting to orchestrate a corporate death blow. By the time the elevator doors parted at the executive floor, the fallout was already echoing through the corridors. The usual quiet hum of productivity had been replaced by the frantic ringing of desk phones and the rapid clicking of keyboards. My chief public relations officer stood outside the primary boardroom, his posture rigid, his tablet buzzing relentlessly with incoming alerts. He opened the heavy glass door for me, his expression grim. The atmosphere inside the boardroom was suffocating thick with the scent of stale coffee and unadulterated panic. The 12 members of my board of directors were already seated, their faces pale under the recessed lighting. The lead underwriter for our public offering, a seasoned investment banker who handled billions of dollars in daily transactions, was pacing the length of the room. He tugged nervously at his silk tie, his forehead glistening with a fine layer of sweat. "We are hemorrhaging institutional confidence," the underwriter announced the moment I crossed the threshold. 3 of our anchor funds just placed a temporary hold on their capital commitments. The optics are disastrous, Eileen. A grassroots boycott accusing us of human rights violations mere weeks before we ring the opening bell on the trading floor is a nightmare scenario. If we do not issue a retraction, an apology, and a restructuring promise by noon, the entire offering collapses. I did not rush to my seat. I walked slowly to the head of the mahogany table, my heels maintaining a steady, unbothered rhythm on the carpet. I poured a glass of iced water from the crystal pitcher resting in the center of the table. My hand did not tremble. The condensation beaded on the glass, cool and solid against my fingertips. I took a slow sip, letting the panicked executives watch my supreme calm in the face of their mounting hysteria. "Please sit down," I instructed the underwriter, my voice devoid of any elevation or distress. "We are not issuing an apology, nor are we restructuring a flawless supply chain based on the fictional ramblings of an internet personality. We are going to execute a counter-maneuver." The underwriter sank into his leather chair, staring at me as if I had lost my grip on reality. "You cannot ignore a digital mob," he argued, his tone pleading. "They are destroying our valuation in real time." "I am not ignoring them," I replied, setting my glass down. "I am going to redirect their outrage toward a much more deserving target." I tapped a sequence onto the control panel embedded in the table. The automated blackout blinds descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the room into shadow. The sprawling digital monitor mounted on the far wall flared to life. I did not project our defensive public relations strategy or our spotless corporate audit reports. I displayed a vibrant, heavily stylized advertisement for Aura, the boutique clothing brand Harper had launched the previous year. Aura was the crown jewel of my sister's influencer aesthetic. She marketed the apparel line as a beacon of sustainable, ethical fashion, charging premium prices for basic garments by promising her followers that every item was sourced with absolute moral integrity. It was the financial engine driving her extravagant lifestyle. For the past 3 months, my forensic accounting division has been conducting a deep dive into the manufacturing origins of Aura apparel. I explained, clicking a button to transition the slide. The monitor shifted from a glossy advertisement to a series of stark, high-resolution photographs. The images depicted a crumbling, windowless textile factory, operating in an unregulated industrial zone overseas. Exhausted laborers, many appearing tragically underaged, sat hunched over archaic sewing machines in squalid conditions. The next slide displayed a stack of official shipping manifests, customs declarations, and bank transfer records. My sister claims my biomedical firm utilizes unethical labor. I continued the steady cadence of my voice, cutting through the stunned silence of the boardroom. Her allegations are baseless. However, her own designer clothing line is unequivocally manufactured in the exact sweatshop conditions she is currently protesting. The manifests on the screen prove that her shell corporation routes payments directly to these unregulated factories, intentionally bypassing ethical oversight to maximize her profit margins. The board members leaned forward, their eyes scanning the undeniable paper trail projected on the wall. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The suffocating panic evaporated, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. They were no longer cornered executives facing a public relations disaster. They were corporate sharks staring at a bleeding target. "This is verifiable," the lead underwriter asked, his voice dropping an octave, the nervous sweat drying on his brow. "Every single document is authenticated by international customs authorities, I confirmed. We are not going to defend our logistics firm. We are going to release this entire dossier to the primary financial news networks, the ethical fashion watchdogs, and the major social media platforms. We will issue a brief, factual press release condemning the hypocrisy of her accusations while providing the receipts of her own systemic labor violations. We will let the internet tear her apart." The board authorized the strike without a single dissenting vote. Within 2 hours, the corporate machinery executed the directive. Our public relations team disseminated the undeniable proof of Harper's sweatshop operations to every major outlet. The retaliation was swift, clinical, and devastating. The digital mob that had been clamoring for my resignation abruptly changed direction, turning their ferocious outrage onto the influencer who had deceived them. The fallout was spectacular. By mid-afternoon, the trending hashtag targeting my company had vanished, replaced by a fierce campaign demanding Harper face accountability. Her primary sponsors, terrified of the toxic association, began severing ties at lightning speed. A prominent cosmetics brand issued a public statement terminating her contract. A luxury fitness company deleted all promotional material featuring her face. Then came the financial execution. Harper's distribution partners activated the morality clauses hidden deep within her vendor agreements. Because she had lied about the ethical sourcing of her products, her payment gateways were suspended. Her business accounts were frozen, pending a massive fraud investigation. The revenue streams that funded her designer lifestyle dried up in a matter of hours. The golden child was officially destitute. Night fell over the frozen Minnesota landscape, casting long, frigid shadows across the city. Harper had been evicted from the luxury condo abandoned by her new husband and stripped of her digital empire. She sat alone on the edge of a sagging mattress in a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of the Twin Cities, the only lodging she could secure with the remaining cash in her wallet. The neon sign buzzing outside her window bathed the dingy room in a sickly red glow. She stared at her phone, watching her follower count plummet by the tens of thousands. The reality of her total ruin pressed down on her chest, leaving her gasping for air. Her parents were facing foreclosure and could not offer a dime of rescue money. She had no allies left, no safety nets, no one to manipulate. Desperation breeds terrifying alliances. Harper wiped a streak of ruined makeup from her cheek, her eyes hardening into a mask of pure vindictive malice. She opened her contacts list and scrolled past the blocked numbers of her former sponsors, stopping on a name she had previously treated with nothing but polite disdain. She pressed dial and lifted the phone to her ear, listening to the hollow ringtone echo in the quiet motel room. On the fourth ring, a voice answered, sounding equally battered and exhausted. Trent Harper whispered, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of fear and hatred. She ruined my life today. She took everything from me, just like she took everything from you. We cannot let her win. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The disgraced physician sat in his own darkened office, staring at the federal tax evasion notices piled on his desk. "What do you have in mind?" Trent asked, the cold calculation returning to his tone. Harper gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. "She works in the medical sector," Harper said, her words rushing out in a venomous whisper. "She has to maintain a flawless psychological profile for the board. You were her husband. You know her medical history. You have access to the hospital servers. If we can prove she is mentally unstable, if we can leak something devastating enough to shatter investor confidence, the board will force her out. We can destroy her initial public offering. We can burn her empire to the ground." Another pause stretched across the cellular connection, thick with the weight of the conspiracy they were forging. "I know exactly where her psychiatric evaluations are stored," Trent replied, sealing the unholy alliance. "Meet me at the clinic in an hour." The sun had barely crusted the horizon over the frozen Minnesota landscape when the secure line on my desk began to chime. It was a private frequency, a dedicated channel reserved strictly for executive emergencies. I set my coffee down and picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end belonged to Elena Rostova, a senior financial correspondent for a premier business journal. Elena and I had spent the last 3 years cultivating a relationship built on mutual professional respect. She covered the healthcare logistics sector with a sharp, unforgiving precision, and she did not make early morning calls unless the foundations of the industry were shifting. "Good morning, Eileen," Elena said, her tone devoid of the usual pleasantries. "I am looking at a dossier that was dropped onto my encrypted server an hour ago. The sender claims to be a whistleblower from a local clinic. They are shopping a narrative that you are unfit to lead a publicly traded company." I leaned back in my leather chair, watching the morning light catch the frost on my windows. "Define unfit," I replied, my voice steady. "The file contains detailed psychiatric evaluations," Elena explained. "The clinical notes suggest you suffer from severe paranoid delusions, manic episodes, and a profound detachment from reality. The sender included a cover letter warning that your impending initial public offering is a house of cards managed by an unstable executive. I know you well enough to recognize a targeted hit piece, but the letterhead looks authentic. I am sending the file to your secure portal now. I suggest you trace the leak before they find a tabloid willing to publish without verifying the sources." I thanked Elena for her integrity and ended the call. A moment later, my secondary monitor chimed as the encrypted file arrived. I opened the document, my eyes scanning the dense medical text. The cold, clinical anger that had been simmering inside me since the wedding reception crystallized into pure ice. The documents were a twisted, distorted mirror of my past. The author had taken the routine grief counseling sessions I attended following my miscarriage and warped them into mandated psychiatric holds. They weaponized my deepest, most agonizing trauma, attempting to frame my profound grief as a symptom of clinical mania. The objective was transparent and incredibly ruthless. Institutional investors demand absolute stability. A chief executive battling severe undisclosed mental illness would trigger a catastrophic sell-off, terminating my public offering overnight and bankrupting my empire. Harper and Trent were not just trying to embarrass me. They were trying to eradicate me. But their desperation had made them careless. I zoomed in on the scanned pages. The documents were printed on stark white paper, but a faint, translucent crest lingered in the background of each sheet. It was a stylized pine tree intertwined with the medical caduceus. The emblem belonged to Northwoods Research Hospital. The profound irony of their choice brought a slow, chilling realization to my mind. My biomedical logistics firm was currently in the final stages of a hostile acquisition of the Northwoods Medical Network. I knew their digital security architecture better than their own board of directors. To extract deep-level patient files without triggering their modern biometric alarms, a user could not simply log in with a standard password. They needed a legacy hardware token, an outdated security measure issued to senior staff nearly a decade ago. It was a specialized encrypted flash drive disguised as a premium silver writing instrument. The image of Trent sitting in the front row at the wedding flashed in my memory. He had been nervously clicking a silver hospital pen against his knee over and over again. He had retained his administrative clearance from his residency days, hoarding the security token like a technological skeleton key. He used that pen to bypass the hospital firewalls, siphon my counseling records, and alter the text to fit Harper's vindictive narrative. I did not panic. I summoned my chief legal counsel, a relentless former federal prosecutor named Sullivan. He strode into my office 10 minutes later, his suit crisp and his expression unreadable. I turned my monitor so he could view the forged documents explaining the origin of the watermark and the silver pen. Sullivan rested his hands on the edge of my desk, his eyes narrowing as he processed the legal implications. Falsifying medical records to manipulate a financial market crosses multiple federal boundaries, Sullivan stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. This is textbook wire fraud, coupled with severe privacy violations under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. They just handed us the rope to hang them both. We bypassed standard legal channels. Sullivan leveraged our position as the acquiring entity to compel the Northwoods Technology Department to act immediately. We issued a direct corporate mandate to freeze Trent out of the system and lock his legacy credentials. More importantly, we ordered their server administrators to seize his entire digital footprint and transfer the raw data directly to my secure terminal. By late evening, the data transfer was complete. I sat alone in my penthouse, the sprawling city lights of Minneapolis flickering far below the glass, offering a quiet backdrop to the digital autopsy I was about to perform. I parsed through thousands of lines of server logs, searching for the exact timestamp Trent used his silver pen to breach my confidential files. I needed the undeniable proof of his digital trespassing to hand to the federal authorities, ensuring his medical license would be permanently revoked. The search algorithm flagged his login credentials exactly as I predicted. But as the system cataloged his user history, it highlighted a hidden archive directory stored deep within his employee profile. Trent had used his encrypted hospital credentials to conduct discreet personal correspondence during the final year of our marriage. He likely assumed the hospital firewalls would shield his communications from the stringent security monitoring I kept on our home network. My focus shifted. If he had coordinated the theft with Harper using this server, I could legally tie her to the federal wire fraud charges, ensuring she shared his prison sentence. I opened the archived folder, expecting to find recent emails exchanged with my sister. Instead, the directory was filled with messages dating back 5 years. The dates aligned perfectly with the agonizing final months of my marriage, a period where Trent was growing distant and my parents were constantly urging me to work less and focus on keeping my husband happy. I sorted the messages by date, my eyes scanning the sender and recipient details. Harper was not involved in this thread. The sender was my mother, Nancy. The recipient was my husband. The subject line of the very first email contained a single phrase regarding a weekend trip Trent claimed he was taking for a medical conference. I clicked the thread, opening the raw text. The glow of the monitor reflected in my eyes as I read the words my mother had typed half a decade ago. The remaining fragments of my familial obligation evaporated into the quiet penthouse air. I scrolled down, reading response after response, tracing a meticulously documented timeline of deceit. The emails laid bare a secret so dark, so inherently toxic, that it rewrote the entire narrative of my 32 years of existence. My parents had not just favored Harper. They had actively, methodically orchestrated the deepest pain of my adult life, leaving a digital trail of betrayal that demanded absolute ruin. I stared at the harsh blue light of the monitor. The subject line of the archived message read, "A proper introduction." The sender was my mother. The date was stamped exactly 5 months before my marriage began to fracture. I clicked the text, reading the chilling rationale Nancy used to justify destroying her own daughter. The silence of the penthouse pressed against my ears as I scrolled through the digital evidence. Nancy wrote to Trent with a tone of profound conspiratorial sympathy. She claimed I was too focused on supply chain logistics and corporate margins. She stated that a successful physician like Trent deserved a traditional companion, someone who understood the value of a warm home rather than a cold boardroom. She did not just offer a sympathetic ear. My mother explicitly directed Trent to a local charity gala, ensuring he would cross paths with a woman named Claire, a close friend of the family. Nancy provided Claire's private contact information, subtly encouraging my husband to seek the comfort I was apparently failing to provide. The thread spanned 2 years, documenting the quiet evolution of the affair. I read messages where Trent thanked my mother for her discretion. I read replies where Nancy offered advice on how to hide hotel charges on his personal statements. It was a masterclass in psychological betrayal. I had spent those years working 80-hour weeks to build the empire that would eventually pay for their lifestyle, and my mother was spending her afternoons orchestrating my marital collapse. The tone of the archived folder shifted abruptly in the spring of the following year. Howard had discovered the infidelity. I braced myself, expecting to read a message where my father defended his daughter, demanding Trent end the affair or face the consequences. Instead, I found the true origin of Howard's favorite catchphrase. Howard did not confront Trent with righteous anger. He cornered him with a calculator. The emails detailed a ruthless extortion plot. Howard informed Trent that the Wallace family had accumulated $75,000 in high-interest credit card debt, a result of Nancy's uncontrolled spending to maintain their suburban facade. Howard gave my husband a simple ultimatum: pay off the entire balance using untraceable clinic funds, or Howard would expose the affair to me and forward the evidence to the State Medical Review Board. A subsequent message forwarded from Howard to Nancy contained the exact phrase he loved to boast about at family dinners. "I handled the doctor," Howard wrote. "A very shrewd negotiation. Our accounts will be clear by Friday." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Trent had not just hidden his assets during our divorce to spite me. He was actively bleeding his private practice dry to pay the extortion demands of my own parents. Nancy and Howard had sat at my dining table, offering me false sympathy and hollow comfort during the agonizing divorce proceedings, while secretly spending the hush money they had squeezed from my cheating husband. The final remnants of a daughter's guilt evaporated from my chest. Any lingering hesitation, any quiet whisper of biological loyalty burned away in the cold light of the screen. I was no longer an injured family member seeking healthy boundaries. I was an executioner holding a signed warrant. I reached for my phone and dialed Sullivan. The clock on the wall read 2 a.m, but my chief legal counsel answered on the first ring. I instructed him to mobilize the Forensic Accounting Division immediately. By dawn, my corporate headquarters had transformed into a war room. We traced the $75,000 Trent had wired through a dummy vendor account directly into Howard's primary banking institution. It was textbook extortion, compounded by tax evasion and wire fraud. Sullivan packaged the server logs, the bank routing numbers, and the email transcripts into a single, devastating dossier. We bypassed local law enforcement and submitted the evidence directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the federal authorities. Because the extorted funds were tied to a federal tax investigation already involving Trent and his hidden medical assets, the government moved with terrifying speed. It was Thursday afternoon. The sky over the southern prairies was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Down in my childhood neighborhood, Nancy was hosting her prestigious monthly book club. It was the crown jewel of her social calendar, a gathering designed to showcase her superiority. The driveway was lined with imported luxury sedans. The living room was filled with wealthy suburbanites sipping imported tea and discussing literature, while Nancy basked in the glow of her fabricated perfection. I did not have to be there to witness the destruction. My property management firm had installed high-definition exterior security cameras when I purchased their underwater mortgage 3 years ago. I sat in my boardroom watching the live feed on a secondary monitor alongside Sullivan. 3 dark, unmarked vehicles pulled to the curb, effectively boxing in the guests' luxury sedans. A dozen agents wearing navy blue windbreakers with federal insignias printed across the back stepped onto the manicured lawn. They did not knock politely. They bypassed the decorative floral wreaths and forced the front door open, their heavy boots echoing through the quiet suburban street. I watched the chaos unfold through the lens of the porch camera. The wealthy neighbors spilled out onto the front lawn, their faces pale with shock, clutching their designer handbags against their chests. They gathered on the sidewalk, whispering frantically, as agents began carrying out boxes of financial records, computer hard drives, and banking documents. Nancy was escorted out onto the porch. She was not wearing handcuffs, but the humiliation was infinitely worse than being arrested. A federal agent handed her a thick stack of subpoenas and asset seizure warrants. Howard stood paralyzed near the doorway, his confident bravado shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as the agents officially froze every single bank account tied to the Wallace name, seizing the assets purchased with the extorted hush money. The pristine reputation my parents had spent 30 years cultivating died right there on the manicured grass. They were exposed as common criminals extortionists who sold their own daughter's heartbreak to pay their credit card bills. The socialites who had just been drinking Nancy's tea were now staring at her with undisguised disgust. The screen faded to black as the agents concluded the raid and departed. My biological family was financially eradicated. I assumed the war was over. I assumed they would retreat into the shadows, defeated and broken by the weight of their own actions. But toxic entitlement does not surrender to logic. Cornered, penniless, and facing imminent federal prosecution, Howard realized he had nothing left to lose. He reached into his deep catalog of regional business contacts, targeting a man he had met during a previous logistics charity gala. It was the chief executive officer of my largest biomedical rival. Howard was preparing to offer fabricated corporate espionage claims to derail my initial public offering, setting a desperate trap that would threaten the very foundation of my empire. The federal raid should have been the crushing blow that finally taught my parents the gravity of their actions. A rational human being facing asset forfeiture and federal extortion charges would hire a defense attorney and retreat into quiet obscurity. But my father was not a rational man. Howard possessed a dangerous strain of Midwestern arrogance, a toxic resilience built on decades of unchecked privilege and small-town dominance. When the authorities stripped away his bank accounts, he did not surrender. He doubled down. 48 hours after the raid, my encrypted private line chimed. The caller was Valerie, the chief operating officer at Vanguard Biometrics, our fiercest regional competitor. Valerie and I had spent the last 7 years engaging in brutal, high-stakes corporate warfare over supply chain contracts. However, beneath the fierce competition, we shared a profound professional respect. We were both women who had clawed our way to the summit of a male-dominated industry. While my biological family viewed me as a disposable asset, my chosen network of industry peers protected our shared ecosystem with fierce loyalty. "Good morning, Eileen," Valerie said, her voice crisp and urgent. "I am calling as a courtesy. An hour ago, my executive assistant fielded a very strange, highly frantic phone call from your father." I set my pen down, the cool metal tapping against my glass desk. "What is Howard trying to sell?" "He is claiming he possesses documented proof of corporate espionage," Valerie explained. "He told my chief executive officer, Donovan, that your upcoming public offering is built on stolen proprietary algorithms. Howard stated he has whistleblowers ready to testify that you bribed federal regulators to bypass standard compliance checks. He is offering to hand this fabricated dossier directly to Vanguard, giving us the ammunition to destroy your valuation right before the opening bell." I let out a slow, measured breath. Howard was attempting a corporate decapitation. By feeding fraudulent espionage claims to my biggest rival, he hoped Vanguard would leak the accusations to the financial press. The mere whisper of federal bribery and stolen algorithms would trigger an immediate halt to our initial public offering. The institutional investors would scatter, and my empire would implode. "Did Donovan take the bait?" I asked. "Donovan is a shark," Valerie replied, her tone laced with disdain for her own boss. "He scheduled a clandestine meeting with your father for 2 o'clock this afternoon at our downtown headquarters. Donovan wants to review the fabricated evidence. He thinks he just caught the break of the century. I suggest you send your legal team to intercept them at the lobby." A different strategy formed in my mind, cold and precise. "No," I instructed. "Do not intercept him. Let my father walk right into the boardroom. Just make sure Donovan leaves his schedule wide open this morning. He and I have some urgent paperwork to finalize." I disconnected the call and pressed the intercom button for Sullivan, my relentless chief legal counsel. For the past 6 months, my firm had been quietly negotiating a hostile takeover of Vanguard Biometrics. Donovan had been fighting the acquisition tooth and nail, holding out for a golden parachute package I refused to authorize. But Donovan's reckless decision to entertain my father's fraudulent espionage claims just gave me the ultimate leverage. Sullivan entered my office, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Bring me the Vanguard acquisition portfolio I ordered. We are accelerating the timeline." By 10 in the morning, my fleet of black SUVs surrounded the Vanguard Biometrics headquarters. Sullivan and I bypassed their security desk, flanking Donovan in his own glass-walled executive suite. I presented the rival chief executive with a stark ultimatum. If he proceeded with the 2 o'clock meeting utilizing fabricated documents provided by a desperate man facing federal extortion charges, I would personally ensure Donovan was named as a co-conspirator in a federal defamation lawsuit. I would drain his personal wealth through years of litigation, and the acquisition would proceed over his professional grave. Alternatively, he could sign the buyout agreement immediately, accept a reduced severance package, and walk away with a fraction of his dignity intact. Donovan reviewed the unassailable evidence of Howard's federal raid, realizing he had almost stepped onto a sinking ship. He signed the acquisition papers with a trembling hand, his signature transferring total ownership of Vanguard Biometrics to my holding company. By noon, the ink was dry. I was no longer Vanguard's rival. I was their sole proprietor. At 1:55 in the afternoon, Howard strode through the polished revolving doors of the Vanguard building. The security cameras captured his confident, arrogant swagger. He carried a cheap imitation leather briefcase, clutching it tight against his chest. He wore his finest remaining suit, projecting the false image of a powerful insider, bringing the ultimate scoop to the competition. He stepped into the elevator, believing he was about to orchestrate my total financial ruin. The elevator chimed, depositing him onto the executive floor. A receptionist directed him toward the primary boardroom. The heavy, frosted glass doors stood closed. Howard pushed them open, a smug, victorious grin stretching across his weathered face. He stepped into the room, preparing to greet Donovan. Instead, he found me. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, my hands folded neatly over the signed acquisition contracts. Sullivan stood to my right, his arms crossed over his chest, projecting an aura of quiet, lethal authority. The room was otherwise empty. The sprawling view of the Minneapolis skyline framed my silhouette, casting long shadows across the polished wood. The victorious grin slid off Howard's face, replaced by a mask of profound, stuttering confusion. He looked around the empty boardroom, checking the corners, as if Donovan might be hiding behind a potted plant. "Where is the chief executive?" Howard demanded, his voice cracking, the false bravado fracturing in real time. "You were looking at her," I replied, my voice echoing off the glass walls. Howard gripped his briefcase, his knuckles turning white. "What kind of trick is this? I have an appointment with Donovan. We have business to discuss regarding your fraudulent practices." "Donovan no longer works here," I informed him, tapping a manicured finger against the stack of legal documents. "I acquired Vanguard Biometrics this morning at 11:30. This building, this boardroom, and the security cameras currently recording your every movement belong to my diversified portfolio." Howard stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the frosted glass door. The color drained from his cheeks until his skin mirrored the pale winter sky outside. The realization of his catastrophic error washed over him. He had not walked into a sanctuary to plot my downfall. He had marched directly into a steel trap. Sullivan stepped forward, pulling a digital audio recorder from his suit pocket and placing it on the table. He pressed the record button. Mr. Wallace Sullivan began, his tone sharp and clinical. "We possess the recorded phone logs of your conversation with Vanguard executives this morning. You claim to hold documented proof that my client, the chief executive of this newly merged corporation, engaged in federal bribery and corporate espionage. Those claims are materially false, highly defamatory, and designed to manipulate the financial markets prior to a public offering." Howard opened his mouth, a desperate, breathless wheeze escaping his throat. I stood up, closing the distance between us. "You tried to sell fabricated lies to a company you thought was my enemy," I said, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "You wanted to destroy my livelihood because I stopped funding your delusions. But you forgot one crucial detail, Howard. You are an amateur playing a game you do not understand." I pointed to the cheap briefcase clutched in his hands. "If you open that case and present those fabricated documents, you will be committing documented corporate defamation against a multi-billion-dollar entity on recorded surveillance." I warned him. "I will not just sue you for damages. I will hand the footage to the federal agents who are already auditing your frozen bank accounts. They will add corporate sabotage and market manipulation to your pending extortion charges. You will not just lose your house. You will spend the rest of your natural life in a federal penitentiary." Howard looked down at the briefcase. It held the fake whistleblower reports Harper and Trent had likely helped him manufacture. It was his final desperate bullet, and the chamber was jammed. His hands shook so violently, the metal clasps of the briefcase rattled against the leather. He realized he had zero leverage. His daughter was ruined. His former son-in-law was facing prison. His bank accounts were seized. And the rival corporation he hoped would be his savior was now just another wing of my expanding empire. "I am your father," Howard whispered, a pathetic, broken plea slipping past his lips. The arrogance was gone. The Midwestern pride had evaporated. He was nothing but a hollow, terrified old man, begging for mercy from the daughter he had spent 3 decades trying to break. "You were my father," I corrected him, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "Now, you are just a liability." I pressed the security button on the wall panel. 2 Vanguard security contractors stepped into the corridor, their expressions stern. "Escort this individual off my property," I ordered. "If he ever steps within 500 feet of this building or my primary headquarters again, have him arrested for criminal trespassing." Howard did not fight them. He let the guards take him by the arms, his head hanging low in ultimate defeat. He shuffled toward the elevators, dragging his feet across the plush carpet, carrying the briefcase full of lies that had sealed his own fate. The heavy frosted glass doors swung shut behind him, severing the last thread of his corporate rebellion. The boardroom fell silent, save for the low hum of the climate control system. I walked back to the head of the table and picked up the acquisition paperwork. The victory was absolute, solidifying my market dominance and insulating my public offering from any further sabotage. The professional war was won. However, the final chapter of my personal liberation was waiting. Tomorrow was the 1st of the month. The 30-day grace period on the underwater mortgage had expired. I packed the legal files into my portfolio and prepared to drive down to the southern prairies. It was eviction day, and I intended to watch the illusion of the perfect Wallace family get packed into cardboard boxes and dragged out onto the curb. The drive from the towering glass structures of the Minneapolis skyline down to the sprawling, fertile flatlands of the southern prairies took just under an hour. The morning sky hung pale and cloudless over the highway. I guided my luxury sedan through the familiar, winding streets of the affluent suburban neighborhood where I was raised. The transition from the relentless pace of the city to the quiet, manicured lawns of this residential enclave always used to fill me with a deep, suffocating dread. For 3 decades, this zip code represented conditional love, unattainable standards, and severe emotional starvation. Today, however, the crisp winter air flowing through my vehicle vents carried the unmistakable scent of absolute liberation. I pulled my car flush against the curb, parking directly across the street from the 2-story colonial brick house I once called a home. I cut the engine and sat back against the premium leather upholstery, keeping the tinted windows rolled up. The property looked fundamentally different than it had during my childhood. The illusion of pristine, untouchable wealth was currently being dismantled piece by piece. A massive commercial moving truck idled aggressively on the front lawn, its heavy tires sinking deep into the dormant winter grass. The back cargo doors were thrown wide open, revealing a cavernous, empty space waiting to swallow the remnants of my parents' fabricated high society lifestyle. A team of burly repossession agents wearing heavy work boots and thick canvas jackets marched methodically up and down the front steps. They carried the heavy burdens of my family debts. I watched a pair of workers wrestle a massive antique mahogany credenza through the front doorway. Growing up, that specific piece of furniture was the centerpiece of the formal dining room. It was a restricted zone. Harper was allowed to play near it, but if I ever brushed my hand against the polished wood, I was sharply reprimanded for risking a scratch. Now it was being unceremoniously shoved into the dark belly of a moving van, destined for a liquidation auction. The front door swung open, violently hitting the exterior brick wall with a loud crack. Nancy stumbled out onto the concrete porch. My mother was completely unrecognizable. The meticulously groomed socialite who prioritized public perception above her own flesh and blood was gone. She wore a rumpled silk bathrobe hastily tied at the waist. Her hair usually sprayed into a stiff, flawless helmet, hung in erratic, tangled strands around her pale face. She was absolutely hysterical. Nancy lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of a repo man who was currently hauling away a rolled-up Persian rug. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with raw, frantic desperation. She demanded they put her belongings down, claiming there had been a banking error, a massive mistake that her powerful husband would rectify any moment. The worker gently but firmly peeled her fingers off his jacket, ignoring her pleas with the practiced apathy of a professional debt collector. Watching her unravel on the porch, I felt a brief, fleeting echo of the little girl who used to crave her warmth. I remembered the countless afternoons I spent sitting on the staircase in this very house, listening to Nancy boast on the telephone to her friends about her perfect golden child Harper, while treating me like an invisible nuisance. The house had been her fortress of superiority. By foreclosing on the underwater mortgage, I had not just evicted her from a building. I had bulldozed her entire identity. From the side of the property, Howard emerged carrying a flimsy cardboard box overflowing with framed photographs and assorted desk knickknacks. He looked thoroughly haggard. His usually crisp posture had collapsed under the weight of the federal raid and his subsequent failure to sabotage my company. He set the box down on the driveway, pausing to catch his breath. As he wiped a layer of cold sweat from his forehead, his gaze drifted across the street. He locked eyes with my luxury sedan. Even through the dark tint of the windshield, he knew exactly who was sitting inside. The exhaustion vanished from his posture, replaced instantly by a surging, violent surge of familiar rage. The deep crimson color crept up his neck, staining his face a dangerous shade of purple. He marched across the asphalt, his heavy footsteps slapping against the pavement. He did not care that the repossession team was watching. He did not care that the neighbors were beginning to step out onto their front porches, drawn by the commotion. Howard reached my car and slammed his open palm against the driver's side window. The glass shuddered under the forceful impact. "Roll this down right now!" he bellowed, his voice muffled but entirely audible through the reinforced barrier. "You vindictive, ungrateful monster! Look at what you are doing to your mother. You are destroying this entire family over ancient history." Ancient history. The phrase echoed in the quiet cabin of my car. He genuinely believed that orchestrating my emotional destruction and extorting my cheating husband was merely an expired grievance. He thought time had diluted his crimes, granting him an invisible amnesty. I pressed the electronic control button. The tinted window slid down exactly 2 inches. The frigid prairie wind instantly filled the cabin, carrying the faint smell of exhaust fumes from the idling moving truck. Howard gripped the edge of the glass, curling his fingers over the top, as if he intended to rip the door open by brute force. "You think you won," he snarled, spit flying from his lips. "You think taking this house makes you a winner. You are a cold, ruthless machine, Eileen. You are punishing us because Trent could not stand to be married to a block of ice. You are holding a grudge over ancient history just to make yourself feel powerful." I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, erratic energy. I simply reached into the passenger seat and picked up a crisp manila envelope. "I am not punishing you over ancient history, Howard," I replied, my tone steady and completely detached. "I am executing a consequence for a decades-long conspiracy." I slid the thick stack of printed documents through the 2-inch gap in the window. The crisp white paper brushed against his knuckles, forcing him to release his grip on the glass to catch the pages before they fell to the street. "What is this garbage?" he demanded, shaking the papers at me. "More fake legal threats?" "Those are the decrypted server logs from the hospital network," I explained, watching his eyes dart down to the top page. "They contain every single email you and Nancy exchanged with Trent during the final year of my marriage." Howard froze. The aggressive purple hue staining his cheeks began to rapidly drain away, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. The second page contains the message where your wife explicitly introduced my husband to his mistress, giving him her private phone number because she felt I was too focused on my career. I continued reciting the contents with lethal precision. The fourth page contains your financial demands, outlining exactly how much hush money you extorted from Trent to pay off your secret credit card debts. The final page is the receipt, showing you used the proceeds of my ruined marriage to finance the down payment on Harper's luxury vehicle. Howard stared at the documents. His eyes tracked across the highlighted sections, reading his own damning words printed in stark black ink. He realized instantly that I did not just know about the extortion. I knew the complete, unvarnished truth about the calculated betrayal orchestrated by his own wife. The ultimate secret he thought was buried forever was currently sitting in his trembling hands. His jaw worked up and down, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single sound. The righteous indignation, the furious fatherly bravado, the toxic arrogance it all evaporated into the freezing morning air. He looked like a deflated, empty shell of a human being. I glanced past him toward the lawns of the surrounding properties. The neighbors had fully emerged from their homes. People who had attended Nancy's pristine book clubs and Howard's lavish summer barbecues were standing on their driveways wearing winter coats over their pajamas. They were watching in stunned silence as the illusion of the perfect Wallace family died an agonizing public death. They watched their former social superiors get stripped of their wealth, their home, and their dignity. I pressed the window control button. The glass slid upward, forcing Howard to snatch his fingers back before they were pinched into the frame. The window sealed shut, cutting off the sounds of Nancy screaming at the repo men in the background. I shifted the vehicle into drive. I did not look at my father again. I pressed the accelerator smoothly, pulling away from the curb and leaving him standing in the middle of the suburban street, clutching the undeniable proof of his own monstrosity. I watched the 2-story colonial brick house shrink in my rearview mirror until it disappeared completely around a bend in the road. The geographical anchor of my childhood trauma was gone. A profound quiet settled over the interior of my car. The war with my parents was definitively over. They were financially ruined, socially exiled, and facing federal prosecution. They had nothing left to leverage and no weapons left to wield. However, the purge of my biological relatives was not entirely finished. As I navigated my sedan back toward the highway on-ramp, preparing for the hour-long drive back to the Minneapolis skyline, my dashboard console chimed. The digital display flashed an urgent priority alert from the central security desk at my corporate headquarters. The golden child had bypassed the outer perimeter. Harper, having been abandoned by her husband, evicted from her condo, and stripped of her digital influencer empire, had nowhere else to run. She was currently staging a theatrical, unhinged meltdown in the center of my pristine glass lobby, demanding a private audience with the chief executive. The final, pathetic act of her entitlement was unfolding, and I needed to return to the city to deliver the closing curtain. The drive back to the metropolitan center of Minneapolis gave me ample time to process the absolute dismantling of my parents. The winter sun hung low in the pale sky, casting long, angular shadows across the frozen Mississippi River. I guided my vehicle into the subterranean parking garage of my corporate headquarters, feeling an unfamiliar sense of profound tranquility. For 32 years, my biological relatives had operated as a relentless psychological parasite, draining my resources while demanding my endless gratitude. Today, I had finally severed the host connection. I handed my keys to the parking attendant and stepped into the private executive elevator. I bypassed my penthouse office suite and selected the mezzanine level. The glass-enclosed walkway offered a tactical overhead view of the primary lobby. The architecture of my building was deliberately designed to project unyielding modern authority. The floors were polished white granite, reflecting the minimalist steel fixtures and the floor-to-ceiling glass panels. It was an environment that demanded competence and rewarded relentless efficiency. Standing squarely in the center of this immaculate corporate ecosystem was my sister. Harper had spent her entire 27 years existing in a state of frictionless luxury. She had been the golden child, the undisputed center of our parents' universe, the girl who never had to face a single consequence for her boundless entitlement. She had monetized that privilege, building a digital empire based on the illusion of flawless ethical superiority. But the internet is a vicious arena, and the truth I had unleashed the day before had acted as a digital guillotine. Looking down from the mezzanine, I could see the devastating physical toll of her rapid freefall. The contrast between her current state and the pristine environment of my company was jarring. Harper wore a pair of faded, shapeless sweatpants that dragged along the polished granite. Her oversized gray hooded sweatshirt was stained near the collar. The expensive designer heels she usually flaunted were gone, replaced by cheap, scuffed canvas sneakers. Her blonde hair, which she previously maintained with weekly salon appointments, hung in greasy, tangled strands across her face. She was pacing frantically back and forth in front of the biometric security turnstiles, harassing the stoic guards. She was entirely bankrupt. Logan had filed annulment papers early that morning, officially legally erasing their 48-hour marriage to save his own startup funding. Her brand sponsors had publicly disavowed her, terminating all pending contracts. The property managers had executed my eviction orders, tossing her curated aesthetic into an industrial dumpster. The golden child was destitute, and the people who usually funded her delusions were currently watching federal agents inventory their seized suburban assets. I descended the floating glass staircase. My leather heels struck the transparent steps with a sharp, rhythmic cadence that echoed across the cavernous atrium. The sound acted as a physical command. The low hum of corporate chatter ceased. Dozens of my executives and analysts paused their morning routines, turning their attention toward the staircase. Harper spun around. Her sunken, bloodshot eyes locked onto me. The moment she registered my presence, the frantic, genuine desperation mutated into a highly calculated performance. She had spent a decade manipulating audiences through a phone screen, and she mistakenly believed those same theatrical tactics would function in a room filled with seasoned corporate sharks. "Eileen!" she cried out, her voice cracking perfectly on the second syllable. She shoved past a bewildered junior analyst and rushed toward the base of the staircase. The security guards tensed, preparing to intercept her, but I offered a subtle nod, instructing them to hold their positions. Harper closed the distance, stopping just 2 feet away from the bottom step. Then, in a display of weaponized melodrama, her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the white granite floor, burying her face in her trembling hands. Deep, racking sobs shook her narrow shoulders, echoing loudly off the glass walls. It was a flawless execution of the victim narrative. "Please, Eileen, I am so incredibly sorry," she wailed, her words intentionally loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "I lost absolutely everything. Logan left me. My company is gone. I slept in a freezing motel room last night, and I do not even have enough money to buy a cup of coffee. You have to help me. We are sisters. Blood is thicker than water." She tilted her chin upward, ensuring the audience of executives could witness the tears streaming down her pale, unwashed cheeks. She was attempting to use my own employees against me, banking on the assumption that I would fold under the pressure of a public spectacle. She expected me to feel embarrassed by the scene, to rush forward, lift her from the floor, and quietly write a substantial check, just to make the humiliation stop. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stopped. I did not bend down. I did not offer a comforting hand. I looked at the dark stains on her cheap sweatshirt, analyzing the profound irony of her situation. She had built her entire identity projecting ethical wealth while secretly profiting from unregulated sweatshops. Now the outside finally matched the inside. "Blood is a biological accident, Harper," I replied, my voice projecting with cold, resonant clarity. "It does not entitle you to my corporate accounts. It does not grant you retroactive immunity from the consequences of your own malicious deceit." Harper gasped, letting her hands fall limp at her sides. She stared up at me, waiting for the stern, older sister routine to soften into familiar submission. When my expression remained carved from ice, a flicker of genuine panic replaced the theatrical sorrow. "You cannot just leave me on the street like this," she pleaded, her tone shifting from a wail to a shrill, demanding edge. "I am your family. You have tens of millions of dollars. You own this entire skyscraper. You could give me a tiny fraction of what you make in a single hour, and it would save my life. I just need an apartment and a small loan to hire a decent lawyer to fight Logan for a settlement." I unclasped the black leather portfolio resting under my arm. I reached inside and withdrew a single sheet of crisp, thick corporate stationery. I took one deliberate step forward and extended my hand holding the paper out toward her face. Harper scrambled to her feet, her eyes lighting up with a pathetic, desperate hope. She actually thought I was handing her a certified bank draft. She thought the public tears had successfully breached my defenses. She snatched the paper from my fingers, bringing it close to her face to read the bold print across the header. The flicker of hope died instantly, replaced by a hollow, suffocating dread. "That is an itemized corporate invoice," I explained, keeping my tone conversational yet loud enough to reach the back of the atrium. "You owe the Lakeside Estate $85,000 for the terminated wedding reception. You owe my property management division $16,000 for 4 months of unpaid back rent on your luxury condominium. I also included a $12,000 line item for the billable hours my corporate attorneys accumulated while tracing your fraudulent international shipping manifests." Harper stared at the massive total sum printed at the bottom of the page. Her lips trembled. Her hands shook so violently, the thick paper rattled against her chest. "I cannot pay this," she whispered, the dramatic volume entirely vanishing from her voice. "I do not have a single dollar left in the world." "That sounds like a severe personal logistical failure," I observed, folding my arms across my chest. "You spent the last 10 years mocking my relentless work ethic. You told our extended family that my dedication to building a real business made me a cold, miserable spinster. You wanted to live in a pristine fantasy world funded by the labor of everyone around you. Welcome to reality." I turned my body slightly, addressing the entire crowded lobby. "The Bank of Eileen is permanently closed," I announced. "Get a job." Harper crumpled the invoice in her fist. The manufactured sorrow melted away entirely, revealing the core of venomous entitlement she shared with our parents. She bared her teeth, stepping toward me with her fists tightly clenched. "You witch," she hissed, her face twisting into an ugly, hateful sneer. "You planned all of this from the very beginning. You waited until my wedding day to destroy us because you are a sick, twisted, jealous person. I will ruin you. I will find a way to tear down this entire company and burn your life to the ground." I did not need to issue a verbal command or flinch. The 2 security contractors who had been monitoring the exchange moved in with flawless tactical precision. They grabbed Harper by both arms, halting her aggressive advance instantly. She thrashed wildly against their iron grip, screaming vicious curses that echoed off the high ceiling. But her physical protests were utterly useless against their professional restraint. "Escort her off the premises," I instructed, turning my back on her entirely. The guards dragged her backward across the polished granite, pulling her through the revolving glass doors and depositing her onto the frozen concrete sidewalk outside. The brutal blast of sub-zero Minnesota wind hit her instantly, whipping her unwashed hair across her face. She stood, shivering on the curb, clutching the crumpled invoice in her hands. The heavy automatic doors slid shut behind her, sealing the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of my corporate fortress. She was entirely alone in the bitter cold, staring through the glass at a world she was no longer permitted to access. The lobby returned to its normal state of quiet efficiency. The executives resumed their conversations, heading toward their respective elevators. The golden child was permanently neutralized, forced to navigate the crushing reality of poverty and personal accountability. However, the final knot of this toxic web remained untangled. I returned to my executive office on the top floor, where Sullivan, my chief legal counsel, was waiting for me. He stood by the window, reviewing a thick stack of manila folders. He turned as I entered, a sharp, predatory smile playing on his lips. "The federal authorities processed the extortion evidence regarding your parents faster than we anticipated," Sullivan announced, tossing the file onto my desk. "But Trent and your father are making one final, desperate, coordinated play. They managed to retain a bottom-feeding defense attorney. They filed a joint emergency motion to halt the asset seizures, claiming our digital evidence was obtained through illegal surveillance. They are attempting to force us into a quiet financial settlement to avoid a prolonged public media circus right before our public offering." I walked around the desk, resting my fingertips on the polished glass surface. "They want a settlement," I mused, feeling a surge of intense anticipated victory. "They scheduled a sworn deposition for tomorrow morning," Sullivan confirmed, tapping the legal notice. "They intend to put you in a room with all four of them, hoping their combined familial presence will intimidate you into dropping the civil damages and recalling the federal fraud reports." I picked up my silver fountain pen, tapping it rhythmically against the desk. The very people who had spent my entire life trying to break my spirit were willingly walking into a confined room, putting their lies on the official legal record. They thought a deposition was a tool for intimidation. They did not realize they had just scheduled their own legal execution. The conference room on the 42nd floor of my legal counsel headquarters felt like a sterile glass vault. The morning sun glared through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, stark shadows across the polished oak table. The faint hum of the climate control system provided the only background noise until the court reporter began typing on her stenography machine. The rhythmic clatter of her keys sounded like nails being hammered into a coffin. Sitting directly across from me were the four architects of my childhood misery. They had arrived together, projecting a united front of toxic entitlement. Howard wore an outdated suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame, attempting to maintain his shattered patriarchal authority. Nancy sat stiffly beside him, wearing a conservative blouse, trying to project the image of a martyred suburban matriarch. Harper looked hollow, her skin pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a cheap paper coffee cup. Trent sat at the far end, sweating through his tailored shirt, shifting uncomfortably in his ergonomic leather chair. They had pooled their meager remaining resources to hire a defense attorney named Gable. He possessed a greasy, unearned confidence, wearing a cheap cologne that smelled like artificial pine and desperation. Gable viewed this entire situation as a standard high-net-worth family dispute. He assumed I was a vulnerable corporate executive terrified of negative press prior to an initial public offering. He thought he held all the leverage. "We are on the record," Sullivan announced, his deep, baritone voice cutting through the tension. He sat beside me, arranging his meticulous legal pads. The trap required patience. Before I could spring the mechanism, I needed them to walk willingly into the snare. Sullivan began the preliminary questioning, establishing their sworn testimony. Mr. Wallace Sullivan started directing his gaze at my father. Did you at any point demand financial compensation from your former son-in-law in exchange for keeping his marital infidelity a secret? Howard puffed out his chest, leaning toward the microphone. I certainly did not, he stated, his tone dripping with false indignation. I am a respected businessman. I do not engage in extortion. The court reporter captured the lie, her fingers dancing across the keys. Mrs. Wallace Sullivan continued, turning to my mother. Did you actively facilitate an extramarital affair for Trent, providing him with contact information for another woman? Nancy placed a hand over her heart, feigning shock. What a repulsive accusation, she gasped. I loved Eileen. I only ever wanted to support her marriage. I would never do such a thing. Another lie permanently locked into the official transcript. Dr. Trent Sullivan asked, his eyes narrowing. Did you utilize legacy administrative credentials to access confidential psychiatric files belonging to my client at Northwoods Research Hospital? Trent swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously. No, he lied, his voice tight. I lost my administrative access years ago. I have no idea how those files were obtained. And finally, Harper Sullivan said, turning to my sister, did you coordinate with Trent to forge those medical documents and distribute them to the financial press? Harper sneered at me across the oak table. I did not forge anything, she snapped. People just finally realized what a terrible, unstable person my sister truly is. I sat perfectly still, listening to the symphony of perjury. They felt so incredibly clever. They believed their united wall of denial would force a stalemate. Gable leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He offered a patronizing smile, displaying coffee-stained teeth. Let us cut to the chase, Counselor Gable said, addressing Sullivan. My clients have endured severe emotional distress and unlawful eviction tactics orchestrated by your client. We understand Miss Wallace is taking her biomedical firm public next month. A prolonged, ugly trial regarding her mental fitness and alleged family abuse will tank her valuation. We are prepared to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and walk away today. All we require is a quiet settlement of $10 million to cover their damages. It was a textbook shakedown. Howard nodded approvingly. Nancy offered a smug, triumphant smirk. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They expected me to panic, to consult nervously with Sullivan, and eventually write the check to protect my empire. I did not confer with my attorney. I reached down and lifted my heavy black leather portfolio, placing it squarely on the table. The soft thud silenced the room. I opened the brass clasp and withdrew 4 thick bound dossiers. I slid them across the smooth oak surface. One stopped in front of Gable. The other 3 rested before my family. What is this? Gable asked, his greasy confidence faltering slightly as he stared at the dense legal binding. That is the end of your career if you continue representing them, I replied, my voice echoing with a chilling, definitive certainty. Sullivan picked up his own copy, opening it to the first tab. Exhibit A, he declared for the record. We have the decrypted server logs from Northwoods Research Hospital. They confirm Dr. Trent utilized a legacy hardware token, a silver encrypted pen, to bypass the firewall on Tuesday at 2 a.m. We also possess the hospital parking garage security footage showing his vehicle entering the premises at that exact time. Trent let out a strangled gasp. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. Exhibit B, Sullivan continued flipping the page. We have the subpoenaed bank routing numbers from a dummy vendor account. They prove Howard Wallace received $75,000 in untraceable clinic funds exactly 3 days after discovering the affair. This constitutes federal wire fraud and documented extortion. Howard shrank into his chair, his false patriarchal authority evaporating into thin air. Exhibit C, Sullivan pressed on, relentless and precise. The archived email transcripts from the hospital server. They contain the explicit messages where Nancy Wallace provided the contact information of the mistress to her son-in-law, actively orchestrating the infidelity. Nancy squeezed her eyes shut, her face contorting in sheer, undeniable terror. And finally, Exhibit D, Sullivan concluded, looking directly at my sister. The Internet protocol addresses traced by our cybersecurity division. They prove the forged medical documents were uploaded and sent to the press from the exact roadside motel where Harper Wallace registered as a guest on Tuesday evening. The room descended into a suffocating, deathly silence. The only sound was the rapid flipping of paper as Gable frantically scanned the documents. His eyes darted across the server logs, the bank routing numbers, and the email transcripts. He was a bottom-feeding attorney, but he was not an idiot. He understood the law. He looked at the court reporter who was staring back at him with wide, shocked eyes. Then he looked at his clients. They had sat in his office and lied to him. They had sworn under oath just moments ago, denying every single accusation. By allowing them to testify falsely on the record, they had just handed him a case of subornation of perjury. Representing them any further would cost him his law license and potentially result in his own indictment. Gable slammed the dossier shut. He shoved his chair back with such frantic force, it tipped over and crashed onto the carpet. "We are going off the record," Gable shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "No, we are not," Sullivan countered, his tone lethal. "The record remains open." "I am withdrawing as counsel," Gable announced, ignoring Sullivan and speaking directly to the stenographer. "As of this exact second, I am withdrawing due to irreconcilable ethical conflicts. I have been intentionally misled by my clients. I want it on the official record that I had no prior knowledge of these federal crimes." He snatched his cheap briefcase from the floor. He did not look at my parents. He did not offer any legal advice. He sprinted toward the frosted glass doors and fled the conference room, abandoning them to their fate. The departure of their legal shield broke the final fragile threads holding my biological family together. The united front shattered instantly. The toxic core that had bound them for decades turned inward, transforming them into desperate, cornered animals. Trent turned on Harper, his face twisting in raw, fierce fury. "You told me the network was secure," he screamed, slamming his fist onto the table. "You said no one could trace the Internet protocol address. You dragged me into federal wire fraud, you stupid, spoiled brat." Harper shrieked back at him, her voice shrill and hysterical. "Do not blame me, you washed-up failure. You are the one who stole the files. You are the one going to prison." Nancy burst into tears, grabbing Howard by the arm, shaking him fiercely. "You promised the bank transfers were untraceable," she wailed. "You said you handled the doctor. Your sloppy banking ruined our lives." Howard shoved her hands away, his face purple with rage. "Do not you dare put this on me, Nancy," he bellowed. "You caused this. If you had not been playing matchmaker with Trent and sending those idiotic emails, we would not be facing extortion charges. You brought this disaster down on our heads." They tore each other apart in the sterile boardroom, their vicious insults captured forever by the silent, diligent keystrokes of the court reporter. They were no longer a family. They were co-conspirators, turning state evidence against one another, frantically trying to save their own skin. I watched the spectacle for a few moments, feeling a profound, quiet closure settling deep within my bones. The ghosts of my childhood, the feelings of inadequacy, the desperate yearning for their approval, all of it vanished, leaving a clean, empty space, ready to be filled with my chosen future. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I looked down at the 4 people still screaming at each other across the polished oak. "Send the expedited transcripts to the federal prosecutor before noon," I instructed Sullivan. I did not wait for a response. I turned and walked toward the heavy glass doors, leaving my biological family legally defenseless, drowning in the consequences of their own actions and facing inevitable prison time. The legal war was definitively won. But as I stepped into the quiet corridor, checking my phone for pending messages, a new notification hinted that one final pathetic attempt at spiritual manipulation was already waiting for me back at my corporate headquarters. 6 months passed. The transition from the stifling atmosphere of the deposition room to the expansive trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange marked a monumental shift in my existence. I stood on the upper balcony overlooking the frantic crowds of brokers, listening to the sharp, resonant ringing of the opening bell. The initial public offering of my biomedical logistics firm launched with unprecedented momentum. The stock valuation surged past all preliminary projections within the first hour of trading, cementing my enterprise as an undeniable titan within the healthcare sector. The wealth I secured that morning was no longer a hidden ledger kept in a dark office. It was a public, irrefutable declaration of my endurance. I had survived their decades of psychological sabotage, and I had thrived. While my professional trajectory soared into the stratosphere, my younger sister experienced a profound, inescapable descent. Harper had once utilized a 30-foot projector screen to brand me a college dropout in front of 300 affluent guests. The universe possesses a stark poetic sense of justice. Following the implosion of her designer clothing brand, the Internal Revenue Service audited her numerous shell corporations. The federal investigators discovered years of intentional tax evasion directly tied to her unregulated overseas sweatshops. To avoid a severe federal prison sentence, a judge ordered Harper to make full financial restitution and mandated her enrollment in stringent financial literacy courses. The woman who once wore custom silk gowns and mocked my education now sat in a cramped, drafty classroom at a local community college. I received a brief, factual update from a private investigator I kept on retainer. He sent a photograph of Harper sitting under flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by peeling paint and scuffed linoleum floors. She wore a faded, itchy polyester sweater. She was chewing on the end of a cheap plastic pen, staring blankly at a whiteboard covered in basic accounting principles. She was struggling to balance simple ledgers to appease her federal auditors. The glamorous influencer who laughed at my humble beginnings was now begging a remedial math tutor for extra credit just to stay out of a jail cell. A flawless, inescapable circle of consequence. My parents fared no better in the aftermath of their legal reckoning. The federal asset forfeiture stripped them of their sprawling suburban estate, their luxury sedans, and their pristine country club memberships. Destitute and facing the looming threat of criminal sentencing, Nancy and Howard were forced to relocate to a dreary one-bedroom apartment in a decaying industrial suburb. The walls of their new residence were paper-thin. The carpets smelled of stale tobacco, and the rattling iron radiators provided their only source of warmth. Their high society friends abandoned them the moment the federal agents raided their elite book club, yet their toxic entitlement refused to perish entirely. Deprived of financial leverage and legal defense, they sought a new avenue of manipulation. they turned to spiritual warfare. The intercom on my polished glass desk chimed softly. My executive assistant informed me that a visitor was waiting in the ground floor lobby. He did not possess a scheduled appointment, but he claimed his visit was a matter of grave spiritual urgency. I pulled up the lobby security feed on my secondary monitor. A man in his late 50s wearing a modest gray suit and a stiff white clerical collar stood near the biometric turnstiles. He clutched a worn, leather-bound Bible tight against his chest, looking highly intimidated by the sleek modern architecture of my corporate fortress. This was Reverend Miller. He was the leader of a small, unsuspecting congregation located just 2 blocks from my parents' new apartment building. Nancy and Howard had joined his flock, painting themselves as tragic, persecuted victims of a cruel, wealthy daughter. They had sent a man of faith into my domain to enact a guilt trip they could no longer deliver themselves. I instructed security to grant him access to the executive penthouse. Reverend Miller stepped into my office, his eyes widening slightly at the sweeping panoramic view of the frozen Minneapolis skyline. He took a seat across from my desk, offering a warm, earnest smile. He truly believed he was on a righteous crusade to heal a broken family. He spoke in a soft, practiced cadence, delivering a rehearsed sermon about grace, forgiveness, and the sacred bond of blood relatives. Miss Wallace, true peace only stems from forgiveness, Reverend Miller urged, leaning forward in the leather chair. Your parents are suffering a profound darkness. Your mother weeps in the front pew every Sunday morning. Your father is a broken man seeking redemption. I implore you to honor the scriptures. Open your heart. Drop these ruinous civil lawsuits and welcome your flesh and blood back into the light. I listened without interrupting. I did not feel a single trace of anger toward this man. He was merely an unwitting pawn, a well-meaning human shield my parents were hiding behind because they lacked the courage to face me. I let his earnest plea hang in the quiet air of the office. I did not argue theology. I did not raise my voice to defend my character. I simply opened the bottom drawer of my desk and retrieved a slender manila folder. I slid the folder across the glass surface, pushing it until it touched the edge of his Bible. I invite you to read the true scriptures of the Wallace family, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. Reverend Miller stopped preaching. He looked down at the documents, his brow furrowing in confusion. He opened the cover and began to read. The folder contained the sworn deposition transcripts, the federal court filings, and the archived email logs tracing their meticulous extortion plot. I watched his warm pastoral smile fade into a mask of pale, breathless horror. He read the exact messages where my mother orchestrated my marital infidelity, providing my husband with the private contact information of his mistress. He reviewed the bank routing numbers, proving my father extorted $75,000 from a cheating spouse to pay off secret credit card debt. The color drained entirely from Reverend Miller's face. His hands, previously clasped in a gesture of pious authority, began to tremble. The thick paper rattled as he turned the pages, unable to reconcile the weeping congregants in his parish with the unrepentant predators documented in the legal files. He realized they had weaponized his faith to attempt a final, desperate manipulation. He closed the folder, unable to stomach the rest of the text. The profound shame radiating from his posture was undeniable. I am so deeply sorry, Reverend Miller whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the revelation. I was blinded by their tears. I had no idea the depths of their deceit. He stood up on shaky legs, leaving the folder on my desk. He promised to return to his parish and confront Nancy and Howard regarding their profound spiritual deception, vowing to remove them from his congregation if they refused to confess their sins. I watched him retreat toward the elevator, a disillusioned shepherd, realizing his flock contained wolves. The departure of the Reverend signaled the true, definitive end of the war. There were no more proxies for them to send. There was no more leverage for them to exploit. I picked up my desk phone and contacted my real estate broker. I authorized the immediate sale of the Minnetonka Lakeside Estate and every remaining parcel of land I owned in the southern prairies. I wanted no geographical ties to the soil that cultivated their toxicity. I wanted the cash liquidated and reinvested into my expanding global supply chains. Then I opened my personal cell phone. I removed the small plastic tray, extracted the tiny metallic SIM card, and snapped it in half. I tossed the broken pieces into the stainless steel wastebasket beside my desk. I had a new secure number, a new pristine life, and a quiet, impenetrable peace. The final string was severed. 2 years slipped by, carrying the debris of my former life away on a steady current of progress. My biomedical logistics firm executed its initial public offering with flawless precision. We absorbed multiple regional competitors, expanding our supply chains across borders. The wealth I generated provided an ironclad fortress, shielding me from the petty squabbles and desperate machinations of the people who once tried to bury me. But true peace required more than corporate dominance. It required physical distance from the geographic anchors of my trauma. I purchased a secluded plot of land deep in the dense northern woods of Minnesota, far from the affluent Minnetonka estates and the suburban flatlands of my childhood. The landscape up here was wild and unforgiving. Towering pine trees formed a natural barrier against the outside world. The air tasted sharp and clean, smelling of wood smoke and fresh snow. Here, on the edge of a pristine frozen lake, I built my sanctuary. It was a sprawling cabin constructed of dark timber and vast panes of reinforced glass, designed to invite the natural light while keeping the bitter cold at bay. Today was the 4th Thursday in November. Thanksgiving morning dawned with a blanket of fresh snow reflecting the pale winter sun. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was a revelation. For 3 decades, the holiday season had been a battlefield. Growing up, Nancy utilized holiday dinners as a theatrical stage to showcase her golden child. I spent my youth listening to my parents praise Harper for her trivial accomplishments, while my academic milestones were met with dismissive sighs. Every meal was a minefield of conditional affection and sharp criticism. That toxic tradition was dead. The aroma of roasting sage, caramelized root vegetables, and fresh baked bread drifted from the open kitchen. There was no tension hovering in the air. There were no hushed, frantic arguments taking place in the hallways. The people gathered in my home today were not bound to me by a biological accident. They were my chosen family, a circle of fiercely loyal individuals who had proven their worth through actions rather than hollow demands. Sullivan, my relentless chief legal counsel, stood by the kitchen island, expertly carving a roasted turkey. He wore a thick-knit sweater instead of his usual intimidating courtroom suit. We had fought federal battles together, dismantling extortion plots and corporate espionage attempts. His loyalty was forged in the fire of those conflicts, making him a permanent fixture at my table. Valerie, the former rival executive who now managed my acquisition portfolio, sat on a leather sofa near the towering stone fireplace. She was laughing freely, sharing a story with my public relations director about a recent supply chain victory. In the corporate world, they were ruthless operators. Inside this cabin, they were relaxed, genuine friends who celebrated my brilliance instead of viewing it as a threat. And then there was Nathan. Nathan stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the frozen expanse of the lake. He was a brilliant structural engineer I had met during the construction of this very cabin. He did not care about my net worth or my corporate title. He valued my intellect, respected my boundaries, and offered a steady, quiet support that required zero performative affection. He turned away from the window and walked toward me, handing me a crystal glass of sparkling apple cider. His eyes held a warm, unbothered familiarity. He did not need to assert dominance or demand my constant attention. He simply walked beside me, an equal partner in every sense of the word. I took a sip of the sweet cider, letting the warmth settle in my chest. I stepped away from the bustling kitchen and walked toward the heavy wooden mantel above the crackling fire. A single silver picture frame rested near the edge of the stone hearth, nestled against a garland of fresh pine needles. It held a candid photograph taken during a similar gathering the previous winter. The image captured Sullivan holding up a toasted marshmallow, Valerie laughing mid-sentence, and Nathan wrapping a protective arm around my shoulders. I reached out my fingertips, brushing the cool glass of the frame. My mind drifted back to the lavish lakeside estate in Minnetonka. I remembered the harsh white glare of the 30-foot projector screen, displaying the cruel labels my sister had chosen for me. Infertile, divorced, loser. That slideshow was a weapon designed to erase my humanity and brand me as a permanent outcast. It was a public execution of my character. This small silver frame was the antithesis of that moment. It did not need to be broadcast to 300 affluent socialites to hold value. It was a quiet, undeniable testament to the life I had built from the ashes of their betrayal. I touched the photograph, feeling a profound sense of grounding. The family in this picture showed up for me without expectation. They did not keep a ledger of favors. They did not extort my pain for their own financial gain. My internal reflection was interrupted by a soft vibration in the pocket of my wool trousers. I pulled out my phone. It was an encrypted email from the private investigator I kept on a nominal retainer. I did not monitor my biological relatives out of lingering attachment. I monitored them to ensure their toxicity remained contained, treating them like a neutralized corporate threat that required occasional auditing. I opened the message, scanning the brief factual paragraphs. The legal system had finalized its devastating work. Trent had officially lost his medical license following his conviction for federal wire fraud and tax evasion. The man who once strutted through hospital corridors radiating arrogance was now working a minimum wage data entry job to satisfy his court-ordered restitution. He lived in a rented room, stripped of his offshore accounts and his elite status. My parents had plummeted even further down the socioeconomic ladder. Following the seizure of their assets and the subsequent extortion trial, Nancy and Howard were evicted from their cramped apartment due to chronic non-payment. The investigator reported they had recently relocated to a subsidized housing unit on the fringes of the city. Their pristine social standing was a forgotten memory. Their former country club friends treated their names like a contagious disease. Harper remained trapped in her own personal purgatory. The local community college courses proved too rigorous for her manufactured intellect. She failed her remedial accounting classes twice, prolonging her probation with the federal tax authorities. The golden child was tethered to a life of grueling, monotonous labor, forced to slowly repay the debts accrued during her counterfeit influencer reign. I read the words on the glowing screen. 2 years ago, reading this update might have triggered a rush of vindictive adrenaline. A part of me might have felt a twinge of lingering conditioned guilt, wondering if I had been too severe in my retribution. Today, standing by the warmth of the stone hearth, I felt neither. My heart rate did not spike. My hands did not tremble. I read the detailed account of their misery, and I felt only a vast, encompassing indifference. They were strangers. Their struggles were the natural mathematical result of their own malicious equations. They had spent 3 decades investing in cruelty, deceit, and entitlement. The universe was simply delivering their dividends. I locked the screen of my phone. I walked over to a small wooden credenza near the hallway and placed the device inside the top drawer, sliding it shut with a definitive click. The past was sealed. I had no desire to look at it again. I returned to the living room just as Nathan called everyone toward the long, rustic dining table. The feast was ready. The aroma of roasted turkey and savory herbs filled the space, mingling with the scent of burning cedar from the fireplace. Sullivan poured generous measures of rich, red wine into our crystal glasses. Valerie raised a toast to a year of unprecedented growth and unwavering loyalty. I took my seat at the head of the table. I looked down the length of the polished wood, observing the bright, genuine smiles of my chosen family. The contrast between this sanctuary and the hollow, performative dinners of my youth was breathtaking. There were no hidden agendas lurking beneath the conversation. There were no financial ultimatums disguised as parental advice. There was only warmth, respect, and mutual admiration. I raised my own glass, catching the reflection of the dancing flames in the deep red liquid. I turned my head, looking past the lively conversation, gazing out the massive glass windows. The frozen lake stretched out into the distance, a smooth, untouched expanse of white snow bordered by the dark, silent pine trees. It was a landscape of absolute peace. I thought about the cruel slide projected at that wedding reception. I thought about the laughter of the crowd and the smug satisfaction on my parents' faces. They called me forgotten. They were right. Because as I looked at the people who actually loved me, my biological family was finally, completely forgotten. The American dream has long been wrapped in a very specific, meticulously manicured packaging. We are conditioned from childhood to revere the portrait of the traditional nuclear household, the sprawling suburban home, the Sunday dinners, the polite smiles exchanged over neighborhood fences, and the unyielding belief that biological ties are an unbreakable, sacred covenant. We are taught that lineage is the ultimate virtue, the bedrock of our culture. But as the story of the Wallace family so brutally illustrates, when a household prioritizes the pristine preservation of a public image over the messy, vital work of emotional honesty, the foundation rots entirely from the inside out. Parenting is not a performative art. It is a profound, terrifying responsibility that requires an unwavering commitment to fairness, emotional awareness, and radical truth. Nancy and Howard Wallace treated their roles not as guardians of human development, but as directors of a stage play where they cast their daughters in rigid, unchangeable roles. In doing so, they committed the quietest, most socially acceptable form of psychological violence. When we examine the wreckage of their legacy, the immediate villains appear to be extortion and greed. Yet their deepest crime occurred decades before the first blackmail email was ever drafted. Their ultimate failure was a complete absence of equity. In traditional American culture, we often confuse providing for our offspring financially with nurturing them emotionally. We assume that because there is food on the table, a roof overhead, and perhaps a country club membership, the parental obligation is fulfilled. But emotional awareness, the ability to see an individual for who they truly are rather than what they can do to inflate a parental ego, is the actual sustaining currency of love. Consider the tragic arc of Harper, the undisputed golden child. Conventional wisdom suggests that the favored sibling is the lucky one, the recipient of endless bounty and unconditional support. But the narrative reveals a much darker, insidious reality. Raising a human being without boundaries, shielding them from every natural consequence, and funding their delusions of superiority is not an act of affection. It is a form of developmental sabotage. By handing their youngest daughter the world on a silver platter, the architects of this household effectively crippled her. They left her entirely unequipped to navigate a society that demands competence and accountability. When the artificial safety net was finally yanked away, she did not just stumble. She shattered. She was left stranded in the freezing Minnesota winter, utterly devoid of the resilience required to survive. The golden child is often the most tragic victim of toxic favoritism, condemned to a life of perpetual dependent infancy. On the opposite end of the spectrum sits Eileen the scapegoat, the daughter conveniently branded as the strong one. Within the framework of many traditional families, the resilient, independent offspring is quietly abandoned. Guardians who lack emotional depth mask their neglect with the convenient excuse of their child's inherent strength. They mistake stoicism for a lack of need. They demand the scapegoat act as the familial anchor both emotionally and financially, while simultaneously punishing them for the very independence that keeps the ecosystem afloat. Eileen's journey exposes the brutal reality that being labeled the responsible one is rarely a genuine compliment. It is usually a convenient rationalization for parental desertion. Raising the next generation requires the courage to practice absolute transparency. It means admitting when we are wrong, setting equitable boundaries for every sibling, and recognizing that our descendants are not extensions of our own unfulfilled ambitions. True familial responsibility is not about maintaining a flawless facade for the neighborhood book club or the local congregation. It is about fostering an environment where a young mind feels safe enough to fail, secure enough to tell the truth, and valued enough to exist without exhausting conditions. The Minnesota Nice facade, a polite exterior masking a cruel interior, is a dangerous cultural crutch. It allows society to smile warmly in public while emotionally starving its most vulnerable members in private. If we are to draw any lasting, long-term guidance from this saga, it is that we must actively dismantle the destructive myth of unconditional loyalty. We must teach the youth that love is a continuous action, not a genetic default. We must raise them to understand that their self-worth is not tied to their ability to serve as a prop in someone else's manufactured narrative. We must guide them to build their own tables rather than begging for scraps at a table where they are secretly despised. Stories like this one challenge the very core of our societal conditioning. They force us to look in the mirror and ask terrifying questions about our own dining rooms, our own unspoken resentments, and the roles we have blindly accepted to keep the peace. If you find yourself nodding along, recognizing the subtle, quiet cruelties hidden behind closed suburban doors, you are not alone in the dark. I invite you to join our growing community of truth seekers. Please subscribe and follow Amanda Told Stories, where we continue to explore the complex, sometimes painful, but ultimately liberating realities of the human experience. Share your thoughts in the comments because naming the shadows is the first crucial step into the light. As we reflect on the desolate, peaceful silence of Eileen's final victory in her northern woods sanctuary, we are left to confront a philosophical paradox that defies everything we were taught in Sunday school. The conventional narrative insists that family is everything, that forgiveness is mandatory, and that walking away is a fundamental failure of character. But the ashes of the Wallace dynasty teach us a much harder, infinitely more necessary truth. Sometimes the most profound act of self-preservation, and indeed the most morally sound decision a person can ever make, is to stop forgiving. We are constantly lectured that holding on to a boundary is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But what if the culturally mandated forgiveness is the actual poison? What if continuously offering grace to those who refuse to change is merely an open invitation for further destruction? The true tragedy of the American family is not that it occasionally fractures. It is that society aggressively demands we glue the shattered pieces back together, even when the jagged edges guarantee we will continue to bleed. Blood does not forge a true bond. It merely determines a biological starting line. Authentic kinship is a fortress built on mutual respect, and it is a fortress you are absolutely allowed to construct from scratch using materials of your own choosing. The ultimate lesson woven through this narrative is not about the triumph of wealth over poverty, nor is it about the fleeting satisfaction of corporate revenge. It is the quiet, radical realization that you do not owe your existence to the people who gave you life. You owe it entirely to the person you choose to become. Look closely at your own life, at the heavy obligations you carry, and the hands that placed them on your shoulders. Are you staying because you are genuinely loved? Or are you staying because you were conditioned to believe you have no right to leave? In a world obsessed with preserving the illusion of the perfect household, sometimes the only way to save your own soul is to let the people who claim to love you become entirely, beautifully forgotten.